Okay, good morning to everyone and welcome to the fourth meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee for 2026. Our first item of business is a decision on taking items 5 and 6 in private. Item 5 is the consideration of today's evidence on the draft climate plan. I'll get this out in a minute. I've said it enough times. The draft climate change plan. We'll also use this item to consider the evidence we heard in previous meetings. Item 6 is consideration of the committee's work programme. Are we all agreed to take that in private? We are. Item 2 is a consideration of a draft statutory. Yep, thank you. And again, I have made the same mistake by not acknowledging that Sarah Boyack is attending today as Monica's substitute, which is rude of me not to do that, but thank you, Sarah, for attending. So agenda item 2 is consideration of a draft statutory instrument, the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Order 2026. The instrument makes various changes to the UK Emissions Trading Scheme. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee has made no comment on the instrument in their report, but noted that the draft instrument has been withdrawn and relayed twice, first due to errors identified by the responsible ministers and subsequently following questions raised by the committee with the Scottish Government. I welcome to the meeting Gillian Martin, the Cabinet Secretary for Climate Action and Energy, and her supporting officials. Lucy Geoghegan, the Head of Unit for Net Zero Economy and Carbon Markets, Natalie Bertagna, the Senior Policy Advisor, and Norman Munro, lawyer, all for the Scottish Government. The instrument is laid under the affirmative procedure, which means it cannot come into force unless the Parliament approves it. Following the evidence session, the committee will be invited to consider a motion to recommend the instrument be approved. I remind everyone that the Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate that follows. Cabinet Secretary, I think you would like to make a short opening statement and also allude to an issue that may have appeared last night. Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, thank you, Convener. I think it's helpful for me to make a short statement just to take us through the instrument. And I'm pleased to provide evidence supporting the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Order 2026. The Emissions Trading Scheme, or the ETS Authority, formed by the 4 nations of the UK, is implementing changes to strengthen the climate ambition of the ETS while protecting our businesses and industries. These technical changes focus on the methodology for distributing free allocation of UK ETS allowances, and this is the UK's primary policy instrument to address carbon leakage, where emissions move to another jurisdiction with lower carbon prices. And as the committee will be aware, ETS participants must purchase an allowance for each tonne of CO2 emitted. However, some allowances are given for free to sectors deemed at risk of carbon leakage. The ETS Authority has consulted extensively on free allocation policy to ensure that, crucially, it's working to incentivise emissions reduction and protect energy-intensive trade-exposed industries from the risk of carbon leakage. The Authority published a consultation response in November last year, outlining changes for the next free allocation period from 2027, and this instrument implements the commitments that are included in that response. So I'll go through each one of them. The first one is the choice for operators to exclude activity data for 2020 or 2020 and 2021 from historical activity level calculations to account for COVID-19 impacts. And having heard stakeholder concerns on the impact of COVID-19, the instrument ensures that an operator's historical activity level is representative, so they do not lose out on free allowances due to the impact that COVID had on production in many sectors. Secondly, the instrument also updates the benchmarks used to calculate free allocations, and it will retain current benchmarks for 2027 with the intention to adopt EU benchmark values from 2028. And this ensures that recent emissions efficiency improvements are reflected in free allocations while aligning with the EU, as it's the Scottish Government's position and called for by stakeholders to support linking negotiations. And third, to ensure all carbon leakage mitigation measures work cohesively, including ETS free allowances and the UK Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or UK CBAM, The instrument will gradually reduce free allocation for sectors covered by the UK CBAM to ensure a smooth transition for those sectors: aluminium, cement, fertiliser, hydrogen, iron and steel sectors. And lastly, there's a clarification to current legislation that makes clear to operators of installations which cease to be free allocation installations as a result of either permanent cessation, as currently provided for, or the surrender or revocation of the operator's permit, that even if they cease operations before the end of the relevant scheme year, they're required to report final year activity levels. And this requirement ensures that free allocations align with actual emissions and prevent over-allocation. So these technical changes ensure fairness and accuracy in free allocation distribution, and whilst continue to support these sectors. And I have to let the committee know I am aware of a minor error which was identified by the Welsh Senate's Legislation, Justice and Constitution Committee. This is an issue that does not impact the operability of this instrument. It's actually one word, the word period. It should have been erased and removed as it was replaced by another term. The authority is working together to determine the best option for amending this, seeking resolution at the earliest opportunity, and the Scottish Government is working with other members in the authority to ensure that we improve the ETS-SI drafting and legislative process in future, but it does not have any material impact in the operation of the instrument. So I'm happy to answer any questions the committee might have, Convener.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. And just before I ask any questions, just because this instrument does relate to fertiliser, I would remind members of my register of interest that I am a farmer in Murray and I do use fertiliser. So, Cabinet Secretary, going to the last point first, which is perhaps on the drafting error, you could perhaps clarify to me, whilst it might be a word, it is quite a large impact, I'm told. What is the solution to that going to be? Is it that all four nations work together to come up with a new SI that's laid before the committee to be considered? How do you get round it? I want to know what the solution is.
I'll bring in Norman Munro because he's actively knows all the instruments that might be available to the UK government. I would just say it does not have an impact on the working of the SI at all. It's just a word that really is actually duplicating the meaning to another term. But Norman, could you take us through what the solutions that have been presented?
There is consideration across the UK ETS Authority on the appropriate vehicle to correct this error. Vehicles that are being considered are a correction slip or finding a suitable legislative vehicle. This is, I think, the 14th UK ETS instrument since the UK ETS was established, and so there are always available instruments in order to take forward amendments at a later point. So those are the two vehicles that are being considered to remedy this error at the earliest convenience.
If I can just give you the exact phrasing, so it's the relevant period, but they've inserted scheme year to replace. It's meant to replace the word period. So really, it's the extraction of that word period that is required.
I realise it's quite a single word. I understand that. I was just trying to understand it. Norman, every day is a learning day in the Parliament for me. I've never heard of a correction slip. Help me. Is it something that we use in the Scottish Parliament? People might not be used to the term. I'm certainly not used to it.
Of course, yes, we do use it in the Scottish Parliament. A correction slip is once an instrument is made and has been laid before Parliament, if there is an error which is perceived to be of a minor nature, then a correction slip can be added and it will go on legislation.gov alongside the instrument, and it will just say, it will make the necessary amendment. It's often used in areas where parts of the instrument which are unable to be amended, for example, in footnotes and things of that nature.
So is that something that the committee then has to consider as a separate bit of... Sorry, I've 10 years I've been convening committees. I've never come across a correction slip, so I'm just trying to delve into it so I understand. So is that something the committee has to look at again? Is it like bringing the SI back?
afraid we don't do correction slips an awful lot. More often than not, the intention is to make an amendment through an amending instrument. Correction slips are relatively rare, but my understanding is that it wouldn't undergo formal process, much like a full instrument.
Every day is a learning day for you as well, I think, Norman. I think that it's not a normal procedure, the clerks are telling me, but it can be done. And I'd be interested to see, once it's identified, what the best way to take this forward. But I'm sort of getting from what you're saying, Cabinet Secretary, that you're confident that this could move forward with knowing full well that error's there and it could be corrected in the short term.
Yeah.
Would that be before the end of this parliamentary session?
I'll need to write to you once we've actually bottomed out the method which is going to be taken forward. So if you allow me to, we're still looking at the methods there. If it is a correction slip, whatever that is, we will write to the committee and let them know.
Thank you, and I will continue my learning process on how this is done. It's had quite a messy birth, this SI, I think, having been withdrawn a couple of times, and before we get to it. But turning to the actual details within it, if I may, Cabinet Secretary, what are the main... sorry, Sarah, did you have a question on the procedure? You sort of caught my eye. And, yeah.
Did, Convener, because I hadn't heard of a correction slip either, and I just wanted a clarification on it. So I think that's useful to have that on the record, that there are two ways that you can address this. Neither are significant, but as long as it gets the support of all the 4 nations, it is then workable and we would get informed. I think having that on the record is really important. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think the difficulties of perhaps getting all 4 to agree might extend the process, and it might therefore take it out of the time that I'm in the Parliament, but maybe, hopefully not. Anyway, turning, Cabinet Secretary, to the substantive part of the thing, what are the main impacts that Scottish businesses will feel as a result of the changes to the free allocation brought about by this instrument? What are Scottish business going to feel?
Well, there has been a BRIA done with this, and of course, this instrument, the ETS instrument, is actually designed to protect businesses that have, high emissions, but are, obviously performing a necessary function in what they produce. So the free allocations are obviously given to high-emitting businesses for which industry needs to operate. And of course, what's coming into force is the CBAM as well, which is actually going to put additional levies on top of imports that don't have the same kind of ETS in the countries that they're producing in as well, which will further protect businesses as well. So if you take any of the high-emitting industries in Scotland, you'll see that they have substantial free allocations associated with them. But when it comes to their competitors, out with the UK, the new mechanism that the UK are bringing in, which is going to be phased in as the free allocations drop, will be the carbon, the CBAM. And that effectively is going to protect those businesses from that kind of competition, which will come from imports from countries that really don't have the same, I suppose, sort of emissions trading function or procedure that we have in the UK. Okay. Which would, if we didn't have, would put them at a disadvantage.
So you're pretty sure that the effects to Scottish businesses, you're saying, are actually good effects, not bad effects?
Yes, because if they are high emitting, there are more free allocations associated with their business.
Okay. One of the issues that we've heard constantly, or I've heard constantly in the last 4 or 5 years, is the fact that things change and change so quickly that it doesn't give any certainty for businesses to invest in what they're doing. So my question is, do you think this instrument gives the businesses in Scotland the certainty they need to invest in making the changes that they're being required to make?
Well, yes, it's actually addressing some issues that have been brought to the attention of all four governments. I think one of the things that this instrument does, if I just go through, it's mitigating the impact of the to I suppose, the highest years of COVID inactivity associated with it. So it's adjusting that so that they don't have to take that into account. It's also updating the benchmarks using free allocation to reflect emissions efficiency improvements as well. So it's actually looking at emissions efficiency for each applicant. And it means that it's going to be enabling the reduction of free allocation annually in the period of 2027 to 2030 over the period of time for sub-installations that will be covered by the CBAM. So it's actually effectively a phased approach there for which businesses can actually plan.
So thank you for explaining what it does. And it was the final sentence. I'm looking for you just to clarify on the record that you believe that this gives businesses the certainty to invest in the future and it won't be changed again. As it's already, this is on its, I can't remember how many iterations this has had, but
it's not really my gift to say what the UK government will do, because obviously the ETS is a UK government instrument and the CBAM is also UK government. So obviously the four nations are kept in the loop about what the direction of travel is by the UK government. And of course ETS is not new. The UK ETS was a replacement to the EU ETS as a result of Brexit. So it was brought in by the previous UK government as well to replace that mechanism, because it was seen if we did not have a replacement for that, it would leave businesses vulnerable. So there's actually been a long period of time since, since we did, would be at the end of the last Parliament when I was sat in the chair that you're in, where we were actually looking at the implementation of a UK ETS 5 years ago, which was to replace given that we had were exiting the European Union. So that's a great deal of, I suppose, notice. I guess the uncertainty at that point 5 years ago would have been about whether the UK ETS was actually going to work. But of course it has been working for the last 5 years.
Okay, I'm just looking to see if any other committee members has. Douglas, you've got a question.
I had a question around, obviously, fertilisers is within scope of this this instrument. It was really just to get some assurance that there wouldn't be an increase in the cost of fertilisers to our farmers when this comes into play.
I don't see that it would have any effect on the cost of fertiliser.
Okay.
But I mean, it's difficult for me to be able to predict what will happen in the markets, but as a result of this is actually going to be continuing that protection that there is in terms of the free allocation to businesses that are manufacturing in high emitting areas in the UK. Obviously quite a lot of fertiliser is imported. In fact, I think the vast majority of fertiliser is actually imported. So whatever happens in other countries is obviously it will be the thing that drives any price increases. But of course, the CBAM makes it so that if there's imports coming in, that there is a fairness associated with it when it comes from countries that don't have an ETS. So if we were to have a fertilising company set up in the UK, they would not be put at a disadvantage, because maybe another country from which we're importing fertiliser has that advantage of not having to be involved in an ETS system.
But in terms of imported fertiliser, this wouldn't make any changes to the cost on that?
I couldn't possibly answer that. I don't know what will make the changes to the cost. There'll be other factors involved in the cost of fertiliser, not least the cost of fuel, which will have an impact on all costs of anything that's imported.
Yeah, I understand there's other factors, but in terms of this instrument, there's nothing here that will increase the cost of fertilisers to our farming community.
I find that impossible to say with any certainty what it will do to the cost of anything, but certainly my officials can maybe come in and assist me here, but in terms of the business impact that's been done on this, it is actually protecting businesses in the UK. Of course, the cost of imports, coming back to that, there are many factors that would increase the cost of fertiliser, not least any kind of energy security issues or any kind of global impacts. But I don't see this instrument as having any material difference in that respect.
It keeps looking for an opportunity. It's not for me to bring her in, but just in case you want to.
Just to back up what you said, I think the clarification here is what is in this SI is about how free allocations that are given to any UK fertilising producers, how those free allocations will be phased out gradually over a 9-year period as the UK CBAM is introduced, so that that price difference doesn't impact the cost that's applied on imported fertiliser. But as CABSEC said, whatever happens to the cost of imported fertiliser is down to the UK CBAM, which is a UK government reserved policy area.
Which is not part of this
This
SI.
is not part of this SI.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Douglas. Sarah.
On the issue about the question the convener asked about to what extent this will incentivise businesses to invest now, given the changes that are going to take place incrementally, but actually quite significantly over the next few years. I was thinking particularly about the hydrogen sector and the discussions about grey, green and blue hydrogen. To what extent will that support investment now because of these changes taking place?
I'm not entirely sure that this particular instrument has any incentivisation or otherwise. I mean, it's not really about that. I think that the main thing is about the phasing, as Lucy just said, the phasing out of the free allocations as CBAM's brought in, and I guess that. If there is any incentivisation, it's the fact that you're not. If you're talking about hydrogen, then you're not disadvantaging hydrogen producers in this country over imports of hydrogen, should that be a thing that maybe come from more high-emitting processes. So if there is, but I really don't think this SI really has anything in the way of that. It really is about protecting, and as you point out, giving fair notice of the CBAM implementation and the gradual phasing out of the free allocations in a way that's not going to put businesses at a disadvantage.
Thank you.
Okay, if there's no other questions, just before we move on to the next bit, Cabinet Secretary, I note what you've said about the instrument being the drafting error in the instrument being a minor change. I could say before we move on to the next thing, if you wanted to pause the next section and bring it back next week when you've had a chance to look at it, I would make, as convener of the committee, I'd make every opportunity to allow you to do that. But if you feel confident that it is such a minor issue that you want to push it today, I'm not going to stand in your way. All I'm saying is we will do what we can to help you with that minor drafting error if you request the time from us. So don't feel you have to go to the next stage.
Let's press it today because it will have an implication for all four administrations if I don't do so. So I would like to move forward.
I think our decision on that would have to have been made by the 10th of February, so we could have done it next week. But I've made the offer, Cabinet Secretary, and you've made your decision. That's fine. So we'll move on to agenda item 3, which is a debate on S6 19991, calling for the committee to recommend that the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Trading Scheme Amendment Order 2026 be approved. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary.
I'll simply move the motion.
Thank you very much. Now, I would ask any members that want to make a contribution at this stage. No, I think most of the debate's been had in the previous thing, especially about the drafting area. So, as there have been no comments, Cabinet Secretary, I assume your summing up and response to the debate will be very limited, if you want to make it. Thank you very much. So the question is that S6M 19991 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary be approved. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. And before we finish on this, I'm going to invite the committee to delegate authority to me as convener to approve a draft of the report for publication. Are we all happy with that? We are. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you to your officials. And I'm now going to suspend briefly to allow a changeover of witnesses. Thank you. welcome back to the meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. This is our fourth item of business this morning. Is an evidence session on the Scottish Government's draft climate change plan. This sets out how the Scottish Government intends to meet its carbon emissions reductions target. The committee is leading a cross-committee effort to scrutinise the draft plan, and the Scottish Government has said it will lay the final plan before the end of March, when the Parliament goes into recess. Everyone giving evidence today will be contributing towards the report we'll be publishing in late February, with a debate in the Chamber that will follow. First of all, I'd like to welcome Claire Mack, the Chief Executive of Scottish Renewables, Gemma Grimes, the Director of Policy and Delivery for Solar Energy UK, and Professor Matthew Hannon, Professor of Sustainable Energy Business and Policy from the University of Strathclyde. So, thank you, all of you, for attending this morning. And we're largely going to be focusing this morning on renewable energy as it relates to the draft plan. And I'm going to go with the first question, which is always the easy one at the beginning, just to feel relaxed. So, would each of you like to set out your overall views on the draft climate change plan? Is it good? Is it bad? What do you think of it? And do you think try and highlight, if you could, the most important thing the Scottish Government should bring forward in the plan? And what would you like to have seen more of in the plan? OK, Claire, you've had longest to settle in, so we'll go Claire, Matthew, and then Gemma. So, Claire, off you go.
Okay, so I focused obviously on the energy supply element of the plan, and obviously it's recognised that that's probably where we've made the greatest gains and most progress in the years to date. In seeing it's got strength in terms of vision and targets, it certainly details the policies and plans that are in place to help support the progress in this particular area. Observations on that are, yes, we have made a number of great gains, but I think one of the key points to make here is that the context has probably shifted quite significantly over the course of time, and that's the same that would be true of any long-term plan, you know, and that's something that we have to be alive to, is that there is a much heavier focus on things like consumer costs, a much heavier focus on the just transition, and a much heavier focus on the geopolitical shifts that have actually driven quite seismic changes around energy supply as a whole, never mind within the Scottish context. So I think it's worth acknowledging that context shift is substantial. Heavily substantial, so quite hard to create a plan that would weather those, but that is the task in hand here. So we do have detailed policies and plans. I think we need to be quite clear about how we're tracking and measuring those, because whilst in the overall plan we have a number of stops along the way which are quite detailed, so we go from 2026 out to 2045 with progressive targets to reduce emissions from 57% to 94% kind of as we go, and budgets that have been set in line with that kind of independent advice. I think that would be the piece of the puzzle that I would be keen to sort of talk to and explore a little bit more, is around that, how you measure those detailed policies and plans, how they interact with each other, and how you genuinely understand how they contribute to those numbers that sit in those 5 statutory 5-year emissions limits that are set out on the face of it.
Thank you. Matthew, good plan, great plan. What's it missing?
Thank you, Convener. Well, yeah, I think the plan outlines ambition. I think there is within that some pretty punchy renewables targets around onshore, offshore, particularly solar PV as well, and supporting infrastructure like battery technology. I commend the cross-sector focus. This is not just a renewable electricity plan. This is a sector-wide and energy system plan, and a consideration of both the supply and the demand side. So in that sense, this is meeting the needs to enact and accelerate a system-wide transition. And I commend also the consideration of justice and a just transition throughout. And I think in here there is specific mention of communities and a need to benefit and engage with communities. As ever, draft plans, opportunities to strengthen and tighten. I think for me, the big question here, and I think maybe Claire alluded to this point possibly, but I think we're inhabiting a very different political realm at the moment, not just re-headlines, but also the general public's mood in terms of climate action and climate change. I think as Scottish Government's own climate survey points out, that there is a majority support for climate action. So we stand on a very strong bedrock. But if we look at the UK Government's own attitudes tracker, there are some subtle and quite concerning changes here. And I think in the last 3 years, data available from 21 to 24, there was a 5% swing from those surveyed from considering climate change a concern to being unconcerned about this. Now, you could argue whether this is driving the political sphere or the political sphere sort of driving these changes in attitudes, but we are where we are, and we have to consider the fact that people's lives, on average and in general, have become harder and harder over the past few years. And again, Claire alluded to the changes in energy prices, which have made cost of living rocket. So climate change isn't, for most families, the first thing in the inbox that they need to deal with that day or that week or even that year. So we must consider that, and we need to think about much more carefully about the social contract that we are presenting to the public and how that shakes out at a local, a regional and a national level. So core to this is that communities, you and I, our neighbours, family, friends, they feel the tangible benefits of climate action sooner rather than later, and that they understand they can connect these changes, positive changes that they are experiencing, to changes in government policy. And I think the last thing I wanted to say before I give way is I was encouraged to see the just transition measures included in this draft climate change plan. This is a really thorny issue to get into. I think individually some of these measures makes more sense than others, and we can talk about this in more detail, but my overriding concern is that these aren't connected as a coherent whole, a system of indicators that are trying to track changes against these 3 or 4 core tenets of justice. So what types of justice are we actually trying to shift the needle on, and how are we connecting these to policies? So there is work to be done there, and I'm happy to talk more about that, convener. So that's, may I just add, I think that there's a lot to talk about here about community benefit funds and payments from both commercial, private, public and community-owned renewable energy developments, and how these are raised and distributed. So we've done lots of work on this, and I think one of the key issues facing communities at the moment is how much is actually falling into their hands, and the expected payment per megawatt installed, which has not gone up with inflation in terms of the baseline year since introduced. So communities are missing out on this. Happy to talk more about that. Thank you.
And I think you're going to get a chance to. I wouldn't be surprised later in the meeting. So, Gemma, do you want to say what you think on the plan, please?
Yeah, we very much welcome the plan. However, it is missing solar. There are a few references to solar, but there is no outright target or objective or level ambition. And we were hoping to see the solar vision that was developed in draft a couple of years ago, but that hasn't made to pass. And so we would really look for the final climate change plan to have a much bolder vision for the role of solar within it.
Okay, thank you. Before we leave this subject, I don't know if you've watched any of the evidence sessions before on this. Oh, well, it's going to come as a surprise to you, Gemma. So I'm going to take you to Annex 3, page 51, where we're talking about the summary in the plan of the costs and the benefits of the thing. So this is for all of you. What the government is saying, there's no cost to the governments from the energy supply policies. It'll all be driven by the market. But there'll be significant investment needed. So there's what they're saying, which is, I think, the only one in the plan. There's no benefits and there's no cost to Scotland from what's happening So one of my concerns, I think, based on what Matthew said, is for people to understand if they're going to buy into this plan, what it's going to cost them. So what is it going to cost us, Claire, as householders, if we're going to buy into this plan? Because there's no cost to the government and there's no benefits to the government. Some of the benefits the government have given on other sections are benefits to the National Health Service by reduced treatment and things, but apparently there's not even any of those. So, Claire, what are the costs?
So, yeah, costs come in many different forms and they are spread in many different ways kind of around the economy. And one of the things that I think, I would observe as we move further along this pathway with the plan is that this next phase is tougher than the one that's gone before, because largely what we've done so far has happened, if you will, behind the curtain, as in it's happened at systems level. It's been done very much in terms of the driving factor being energy supply. Going forward, there's going to be a much heavier focus on demand, which does require investments at different levels. And I mean investments as in there are paybacks to these things. I'm doing my own personal home investment at the moment in solar battery and a heat pump. And that means that you've got a bit of a reliance as you move further along the space in terms of reliance on newer technologies, particularly in the industrial decarbonisation space, which is hydrogen and CCUS. The other thing is you've got a much heavier reliance as you go on private sector finance, but also individual household level finance as well. And that requires kind of choices, and you're absolutely right, the benefits case needs to be absolutely crystal clear. I think we've talked about the changes that have gone on around us, and one of the key changes that has happened has been that increase in volatility of consumer bills. So again, one of the other contextual shifts is around creating a stronger focus on security of supply. I think where we started with perhaps with the climate change plan and a climate change journey was a very different place to where the imperative is now. So there are a number of unseen benefits in here, one of which is the health benefits that you're referring to. You're also talking about things like energy security, which does have a direct financial benefit. So being able to stabilise the cost of energy, to remove that volatility. I think in recent years, there's a figure of around 183 billion, I think, has been in the increase in costs of kind of oil and gas import into the UK.
Just trying to drill it down to the Scottish household. Take a house in the countryside that's not got double glazing, not got insulation, has to transfer everything into, put in insulation, put in double glazing, put in LED lights, probably raise the floor to keep the heat in and insulate the roof, may cost them 40 or 50,000. They have no idea what this is going to cost them, and they have no idea of the payback period. It could be 60 years, and then the person in the house is investing, rightly so, in the next generation, you'll say, but there's no return on it, and there's no idea of what it's going to cost. Do you think that's a failure of the plan, Claire?
I think we need to be, and I can give you this from direct personal experience. Like I say, I am on that pathway right now, and I can tell you the costs to me personally have been around £34,000. I have had support in amongst some of that, and I'm very lucky to live in a home where I didn't have to change underfloor heating. I didn't really have to change all. I didn't have to change all of my radiators, and I didn't need to insulate. But that is one of the key issues: is that there is a huge variation of cost dependent on house type. We've done a lot of good research, and I wouldn't shy away from that in Scotland. We've done a lot of good research into our housing types and what it is going to cost in order to do that, and that's available to Scottish Government because it was carried out by Scottish Government. So it will vary depending on your house type. Like I say, mine is at that figure.
Substantial.
It could be substantial, so it does have to be something that consumers in particular need to understand. You're absolutely right, what the costs and benefits are, the payback periods, because you do need to enter into a very sort of long-term mindset in terms of thinking about this, particularly if you are going to change something. But ultimately, creating a better energy performance rating for your home and creating a lower operating cost for your home. My electricity costs at the moment topped £1,000 a month. That's what they were, and that is why I'm doing what I'm doing. So my payback period, because they're so high, is a lot lower or a lot shorter than your average consumer, I would imagine.
And he says, tongue-in-cheek, that the payback period, maybe for 20 years, may be acceptable for you. I fear I'll be long gone by then. Matthew, do you want to just talk about costings? Sorry, I am a pessimist. I'm going statistically on the figures of the expectancy. Well, it might be a happy note for you, Michael. It's less happy for me. Matthew, do you want to add on that?
Thank you, Convener. So I mean, I think looking at the climate change plan and the numbers that the Scottish Government have presented there, and again, if I understand their maths and the presentation of it correctly, they are presenting this as a net financial benefit when you trade off the sort of costs against the direct and indirect benefits, and in that you've got the co-benefits. So their own sort of working suggests that there is a sort of system-wide benefit. I think the key issue here is, and I think that the Climate Change Commission's own analysis of this, and their kind of I refer to it as a backward S diagram, where they present the front loading of the costs, and over time these will yield financial benefits as, and I think again Claire alluded to this, cuts in energy bills, reduction in shifting from internal combustion engine to battery, and the lower running costs of that. For me, the real sensitive piece is right now, and actually in terms of the political and policy cycle, the next year or two, this is a really sensitive time where people are going to have to, or as a nation, we're going to have to invest up front to generate these savings and yield these benefits. And let's not forget why we're doing this in the first place: to avoid catastrophic climate change, and the costs of that are unbearable and unthinkable. And the science will bear that out. However, we have to make the case that these benefits are going to be felt as soon as possible. And so I think it's not just about the timing of that, but about who benefits and who pays. And that really comes down to a justice point. There needs to be a sense, I think, across Scotland, across the UK more generally, and internationally, that we are paying our fair share, and we are going to reap the benefits and a fair share of those. If we bring it right back to home, geographically, it's not going to work if one locality, a small village or town, is enjoying the fruits of net zero and not necessarily paying their fair share of investment. And 3 miles down the road, we have the inverse situation. So there needs to be some rebalancing at a regional and national level to make sure fairness is writ right through this system and raft of policies. And I think we also need to consider the likelihood of costs and the dividends of those, because everything, as we know from an investment standpoint, everything carries a risk. It's how we then articulate all of this, Convener and committee members, to the general public. And this is why I think there is a really big piece that needs to be played after this climate change plan, or alongside it, about how we communicate this to the general public in a way that makes sense to them and in a way that they feel will benefit them.
Okay. Gemma, you get a chance not to answer the point that Michael made, that it might be good news that I'm not around here in 20 years' time, but on the costs element of it.
Yeah, thank you. To go back to the sort of domestic energy retrofit points as one key example, we know that the government is very focused on decarbonising heat and the heat and buildings bill proposals. There is also the Home Energy Scotland loan scheme and grant scheme, and having just had the Warm Homes Plan for the UK announced last week, there is up to £1.5 billion for use across Scotland and Wales. All details still to be confirmed, but there is at least some money coming in this direction from the Warm Homes Plan, and this may be the start. There is a challenge with the Home Energy Scotland loan in that it doesn't apply to solar anymore. It now only primarily applies to heat pumps, but it has been proven that having solar installed with a heat pump can significantly reduce the running costs by about £1,000 a year. And so that would be a great way of demonstrating that just transition, demonstrating the benefits to the widest people and reducing the cost of energy to the widest number. If we could reinstate something equivalent to Home Energy Scotland's loan that also enabled solar to play its part and help bring down bills immediately through on-site generation.
Okay. I mean, I've no idea about the costs of solar. We'll find out about them shortly, I'm sure. Sarah, do you want to ask a brief question before I move to Kevin?
Yeah, it's a follow-up question. I appreciate that comment, Gemma. I mean, I actually know constituents that were about to put in heat pumps, and then when the funding for the solar went, they stopped because it was the joined-up thinking about getting an incentive and then investing. So there's an issue there about supply chains and potentially jobs, confidence, so I very much agree with that. Is there also an issue about, you mentioned the just transition. I think there's some research out there that suggests that people on lower incomes actually having solar panels can make quite a significant benefit to their homes. So is there something about both homeowners and trying to get right across the sector more solar in situ, which actually will be good for our economy, help the just transition and bring down the climate emissions at the same time?
Yeah, no, absolutely, because energy bills, the less money you have, the bigger proportion of your income is the cost of energy. So for those that have the least money, the ability to cut your energy bills via solar and heat pump, for example, makes a real difference, and it makes the biggest impact to those on the lowest income.
Okay. Kevin, I think you've got some questions you'd like to ask.
Thank you, Convener. I want to look at whether the industry is optimistic or pessimistic at this moment, and look at barriers in particular. It's clear that in the last CFD allocation round, no ScotWind projects came into play. I know the industry has said that rising transmission charges are undermining the economics of Scottish offshore wind projects. How do we get over this? Scottish Government does not control transmission charges. The carbon plan is not just Scottish-based, it's UK-based. How do we deal with this, Claire? What does the UK Government need to do? What do they need to do in terms of listening to get this right, to provide optimism rather than the pessimism that I'm hearing?
And you're absolutely right in that had we been talking a couple of weeks ago, we had a recent success in the AR7 auction, but you're dead right that prior to that, it was 2022 before we'd had a Scottish fixed offshore wind project come through that particular system. And you're absolutely right, again, to point to transmission charging as being the reason for that. So transmission charging represents a volatile and variable cost in the lifetime operation of a project. And I think, as we talked about earlier, the way that energy supply will how we will shift the dial in terms of energy supply is heavily reliant on private sector investment, and the transmission charging issue is right at the heart of a lack of confidence in terms of private sector investment. I think in terms of where is industry just now, in terms of optimistic, pessimistic, pragmatic, I think one of the things we need to be really clear about around the recent success versus, abject failure actually in the previous two rounds is that it was lucky. It wasn't by design. It was lucky from the point of view that actually UK Government did a lot to change the parameters of the last auction to make it the potential for Scottish projects to be a lot higher than it was by offering a Scottish clearing price, which gave us the ability to set a different price within the energy system, which ultimately tracks back into the consumer pocket for Scottish projects to alleviate this additional cost, this penalty charge that sits against Scottish projects which also sit in the most abundant resource areas of our country and therefore have a rightful role in the future energy mix in terms of being able to make that kind of contribution. In terms of what we want to do about that, one of the problems with it is that it's a piece of regulation that's been in place for a long, long time. It reflects an energy system of 30 years ago when it was set.
Not one of the major problems that we have.
Yeah.
The UK government, the UK pricing regime, the regime as a whole, is stuck in the past and doesn't take into account what we need to do in terms of reducing climate emissions, and actually has a level of unfairness to communities as well, as Professor Hannan was pointing out earlier.
Exactly, and those tenets of socio-economic benefit, just transition, if we can't get projects here in Scotland, then we fail on those two missions, absolutely. And the transmission charging issue is one that has been talked about for a very long time. We have been trying to speak to UK Government about how they could enact a change within that system. We are continuing to speak to them about that and about how it is that we can then encourage projects in the right places at the right price at the right time without having to create special measures within an established system in order to get these projects through.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if we could turn to Professor Hannan in that optimism and pessimism and not about industry at this particular point, but about communities, which you mentioned in some of your initial answers, because some communities have been pretty optimistic, and then that optimism has disappeared when benefits have not come to fruition. One of the prime examples is probably Shetland, where a huge amount of work has gone on there, a lot of production, and yet Shetlanders still face some of the highest electricity bills, so haven't seen the fruits of the likes of the Viking project. We need to turn that around, do we? And a lot of that is down to, again, UK government pricing regime. We need to get that right for communities, do we not?
Yes, thank you. Very important question. So I think what has emerged over the last 10 or 15 years has been a focus, not least from Scottish Government, and I think we're now going to see this replicated, certainly through transmission by UK Government. It is a focus on community benefit funds as a mechanism to try and to instill that optimism and hope within those communities that are hosting these infrastructures or are going to in the future. So this sense of rebalancing the costs and benefits, but the issue thus far has been these are hyper localized. So the boundaries of that community benefit fund will be determined through discussions between the community and the developer. And they can be as narrow or as broad as that discussion kind of entails and the underpinning community benefit agreement. What I think, where they are very localised, this can create this asymmetry that I mentioned before, where you have one glen where community A is a winner and another glen where community B is not. Where this is being rebalanced to some extent is where we're seeing regional funds starting to emerge. I was giving a keynote last week in Cumnock as part of the 9 community council groups inaugural conference, and their role there is to bring these 9 community councils together and the community benefit funds that they hold to make more regional, strategic and larger scale investments, which can then, I think, start to create a sense that we as a region are in this together. And whilst we are hosting these infrastructures, in their case predominantly onshore wind, that we are all recouping some of the benefit. I think there's two further points to make. Well, there's a lot actually, but I'll try and begin with 2. One is about who controls the. Sorry, it's a test alarm. Hope you can still hear me. Who controls and decides how that money is spent, and that's associated again with how that money is actually spent and trying to track and understand those costs, which is really important to understand the impact, and three, about the price that the amount of money that the developer is then sharing on. And may I just finish with the point that I think in terms of communities benefiting, the really big question underpinning this is who owns the land, who owns the asset? And whilst the model that we are seeing predominantly play out is one of commercial ownership of land, commercial ownership of assets and the onshore wind, for example, and then a predetermined donation to communities, where we are seeing community ownership, or in some cases, such as the Quantones wind farm in Orkney, public ownership, that we are seeing donations at a much sort of larger scale being made. And there are studies that have pointed to this. I think there's one that this committee's probably heard before from Aquaterra. There's also another recent one from Platform, commissioned by Platform London, which points to these dividends coming back to the community being somewhere between 10 and 100 times that versus those from commercial donations. So in terms of that optimism from communities, I think the big question is actually, in terms of how much is coming back, is who owns the asset and the land which it's installed on.
Thank you. Ms Grimes, optimism, pessimism?
Optimism in that we should continue to see more and more renewable projects out there, ground mount and rooftop, and we would therefore see the benefits accruing from those. And there is greater emphasis across all of the nations of the UK around community benefit, but also renewed discussion around shared ownership and community ownership. I think there's a place for all of them. One size doesn't fit all. And I take Matthew's point, but around wholly community-owned projects, but they tend to be relatively small comparatively. And we can't do everything solely by community projects. So we do need a combination of everything.
Okay, thank you. I want to look at other benefits in terms of the transition, particularly when it comes to the northeast of Scotland. Obviously, we don't want to see a cliff edge in terms of oil and gas ceasing, because that will inevitably play badly in terms of finding the right skills for the transition to take place. But equally, we want to see new skills being developed. Now, the convener and I were in Aberdeen last Monday and went to the Energy Skills Hub, seen some of the apprentice welders. One of the courses, which I believe is being sponsored by Ocean Winds, obviously that is a benefit. So how do we get the benefits out of the new skills that are required, and how do we ensure that we do not lose the oil and gas industry too early, to ensure that we can use those folk skills in our energy future? Claire, please.
We've been on the record recently with my colleague Dave Whitehouse at OE UK, basically pointing to the sort of man-made harm that comes from certain policies, one of which is transmission charging, which you've already alighted on, but also the Energy Profits Levy as well, which is actually fast-tracking the decline of the oil and gas sector. And that is one of the things that we have highlighted, is that there is a need for both the deployment of renewables in terms of pipeline, and we've seen some stutters in there, but also that managed decline of our basin and operations as well, because it doesn't just sit within the North East. I hail from Falkirk, and Grangemouth is an absolutely critical facility in this, as well as actually Sullom Voe in Shetland too. So across the country there are key facilities and key workforce and skills that we do need to protect as assets in order to ensure that they can also deliver into the just and energy transition. So I think that is very important. I'm really glad that you have had the opportunity to go and see the facility, the ETZ supported facility, the Skills Hub, because it forms one of the major benefits that do come alongside the kind of energy transition. One of the other elements to this, which I think is worth highlighting just now from the auction that happened last week, the AR7 auction, was that it came alongside an additional funding pot. So all of the developers have been asked to make contributions through Clean Industry Bonus, which comes at a kind of £1 to £17 ratio in terms of private sector contribution to public sector contribution. And that is designed to create more strength within supply chains within the UK in terms of manufacturing, but also to contribute towards skills and upskilling of workforce as well, in recognition that those actually form a key part of our critical competitive advantage in energy, which sits largely here in Scotland as part of the UK.
Some folk out there would be surprised to hear you say that you want to see the demise of the energy profits levy. But all of this is interlinked, is it not?
Yeah.
And if we do not get it right in terms of the oil and gas industry and its future, then we are going to fail in terms of the right skill sets for our renewables future, are we not?
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason, like you say, if you looked at it from a purely climate perspective, yes, that would be kind of an odd thing to say. What I'm looking at is through a sort of economic perspective. I'm a trade association. I'm here to support my industry and actually recognise that we have a key dependency alongside the oil and gas sector as well. And policy, any policy, whether it's transmission charging or EPL, which is causing detriment and damage to industries which are there to help support economic growth and to support workers within this country, really have to be examined more closely for what their impacts are.
Thank you. Professor Hannon, you used the phrase earlier, the coherent whole. In order to get our future right, we have to be coherent and look holistically at all of this. Your focus in terms of some of your answers has been about communities. But if we don't get that change right, if we don't get that just transition, that has a major impact in communities across Scotland, and in particular our poorest communities, does it not?
Yeah, absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. And I think that's where we have to be considerate of, we have to strike this balance. We need a national level coherent plan which considers baking in justice and a just transition into its very heart, to ensure that at a kind of top-down level that these communities aren't going to be left behind. However, it also needs to be flexible enough to understand the essence and the characteristics of that community, to understand its history, its strengths, where it requires investment. And this is where community action plans, local place plans, these types of place-based and place-specific planning is so important, that draw down the principles that are laid out in this climate change plan and other white papers surrounding it, but tailor them to the needs of that community, because otherwise I think something gets totally lost. If you travel from one constituency to the next, and even just from one village or town within that constituency to another, there is a very different context here. And so we need to be flexible enough to consider that. And maybe I'll give you one example, going back to the community benefit funds, is that community has some control, a significant degree of control, in fact, not ideally complete control over how those funds are spent. And those can be aligned with their principles. And maybe coming back to the skills and my example of Cumnock and the 9CC operating in the Cumnock and Doon Valley, they're investing through this or looking to invest going forward into apprenticeships. And there's been there's real opportunity there through a number of what you would call low carbon or circular economy companies, whether it be Emergency One or EGA. There are opportunities there to upskill people in situ and not lose them outside of that rural community. And so I think it's incumbent on the climate change plan and the just transition policies within that to ensure we keep these communities intact and help them grow and evolve.
Thank you. In terms of the skills aspects for solar, Ms Grimes, what are the industry doing in terms of investment there, and how are you capturing the skills that may already exist in some places?
Well, so currently there are around 800 full-time equivalents working in solar in Scotland, solar and storage. And we would expect that to increase to around 11,000 by 2030, 2035, depending on when we reach our sort of 6 to 9 gigawatts of solar capacity. But in order to do that, we need a significant increase in the workforce, and we need a significant increase in the number of training places that are available. One of the challenges that we have is, well, we have many challenges in terms of skills. There is a current skilled workforce for the deployment that we're currently doing, but if we're going to upscale, which we need to in order to bring the benefits that we've talked about in terms of cost reduction, both to the grid scale energy, and to domestic and commercial uses, we really need to see an increase in the number of electricians we're training, the number of grid connection engineers, the number of high voltage technicians. There is also a need for wider construction workers. So, for example, welders, etc., are also needed in the solar sector. But outside of the oil and gas industry, in terms of a just transition, obviously there's the need to enable those living in the rural communities where we may be looking to site projects, to enable them, those people coming out of school in those areas, for example, to consider the renewable energy industry as a job opportunity. And we need to ensure that not only are there apprenticeships and not only are there the college courses, but there is also the practical on-the-ground work experience. That seems to be a real tight a pinch point at the moment, where you're getting people come through the training system for an electrician, for example, but they're not able to get the work experience. And so there's something that the industry can do, not just the renewables industry, but wider sort of built environment sectors, to collaborate on training people, because we need so many more electrical specialists, but we also need built environment specialists more generally.
Thank you. Maybe industry needs to consider doing what Ocean Winds has done in terms of Aberdeen. Convener, I could go on. I will not. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Michael, I think you had a brief follow-up on this before we move.
I did, yeah. Good morning. It's a question for Claire. You mentioned the importance and the significance of TNUoS charges on the industry and the drag that it's creating, particularly for Scottish-based projects, which clearly has a potential significant economic impact on Scotland. What wasn't clear from your answer was what exactly is it Scottish Renewables want the UK government to change, and what would that change look like for it to work for the industry in Scotland?
Yeah. So the outcome, to take us back to that, the outcome of the R7 auction, we saw one fixed bottom site, which is Berwick Bank, which connects into one of the two lowest TNUoS zones in the country. And when I said it was luck, that's kind of why. There is a set of circumstances which cannot now be replicated. We also recognise within that auction there were other projects in the north of the country, and west of Orkney is one of them, who said they did not bid in to the auction at all because they could not make the project economics work. And that is the nature of the problem. So that's what we're looking for UK government to look at, which is that we need to reduce the volatility of these charges. They're unpredictable, but we also need to reduce the level of them. So there's different ways to approach that. You could create a kind of standardised cost across the whole of the country. You could also look, because these charges are there and they are climbing for lots of different reasons. One is because of just the way that the energy system has evolved. It's got certain bottlenecks and constraints within it which are creating cost. That is a feature of us having created the supply ahead of the demand, Again, you could discuss whether that was the right way to do things. I think it probably was, because the last thing we would want is to end up in a pinch point where we didn't have enough energy to go around the country. Yes, it has created some costs in terms of constraint at this particular point in time, but that will be alleviated by building out further transmission infrastructure. And that, again, is sitting kind of at the heart of part of where these costs come from, is that we are creating a wholesale change in the energy system. An energy system that will allow us to take back control of our own energy costs, which will allow us to do the kind of self-generation that we've talked about on a more micro level, but at a more macro level, at a country level. And it will create more security within our energy system. It will allow us to have that level of security and feel confident in that security. There are different ways, like I say, that you could treat those costs, but one thing is absolutely certain, is that at the moment, they are too high and too volatile for us to be able to get projects to be financeable. And one of the issues with transmission costs too is that they get baked into the project cost, which makes us non-competitive when we get to that CFD level, again, which is evidenced by the fact that we're now seeing projects just not bidding into what is an excellent system. The CFD system has generated £60 billion worth of private sector investment since its inception. That's money that rightly should sit within the economy of the UK and within Scotland, and that's what we want to see.
Do you have a preferred model that should be adopted?
We're working with industry, so we have been speaking to UK Government about a set of principles. Certainly, it's hard at this particular point in time to see a transmission charging regime that would see us from today, where we're doing an exceptional level of infrastructure build-out, all the way through to an operational system where we would effectively have built most of the infrastructure that we would need in terms of subsea cables, reinforcement, overhead lines. To see a system that would see us go right the way through there. But at the moment, we've put together a set of principles attached to this, which do sit around predictability, the ability for it to be investable, the ability for us to be able to kind of keep prices at a levelised point for industries.
Okay, and it's not a new issue. It's been kicking about for the best part of a decade, if not 2 decades, with renewables in Scotland. Why has it not changed?
Part of this is because any regulatory change comes with a disbenefit and a cost because it brings disruption, right? And so that's one of the things that's been very much at the heart of the industry conversation is how would you, if you were to create a wholesale change in the regulatory financing system, how would you step that in? How would you make that work? I think the other thing is that we do still have we're in the middle of a transition, so there is still a mixed makeup within the kind of energy mix of the country. So it is a kind of point in time piece where when do you start to switch it over? I think what we've got to now is that point in time where these costs are now actually going to become a barrier to us moving forward on that energy transition journey. So it is now time for us to think about what are the measures that we want to put into place, either for an interim set of time, or whether we want to try and find something that will signal all the way through. Energy is a long-term game, and one of the things that we are expecting of our developers, for example, is for them to place investments in projects for 20 to 30 years. We need to provide that kind of regulatory certainty, and through having a very clear-sighted way of how we see the energy system evolving and moving forward. It's just one of those situations where we've got the ability for UK Government to direct the regulator of the UK in order to do this, and I guess that hasn't happened.
And are you confident it will happen anytime soon?
I'm confident that we are having all the right conversations.
Conversations are great, but
conversations are great.
Will they actually lead to any outcome?
They are. I think if you look at what happens with AR7 with the auction round, the very fact that you started to see a remedial measure come in to mitigate these transmission costs tells you that somebody somewhere within DESNZ and with UK Government, and they did work very hard with us. I cannot suggest for 1 minute or be critical of that. Worked very hard with us and with the sector to find a way of ensuring that Scotland could get get a fair bite at the cherry in AR7. But that in and of itself signals to me that there's a recognition of a problem.
Yeah, well, recognition and doing things are 2 different things, of course.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Michael. I was just thinking that we're probably on the end of question 2. I can warn you there's 20 questions. And we're about 40 minutes into the session, so it could be a very long one. So I hate cutting people off, and I hate telling people time is short, but I'm not going to cut anyone off. I'm going to say time is short. Mark, the next questions rest with you.
Okay, I'm going to pick up the pace a bit then, convener.
Perfect.
Can I turn to the NESO's strategic spatial energy plan? I mean, is that something that the industry welcomes? Is it pitched at the right level? What involvement have you had in developing that? I'm just going to ask Claire and Gemma actually to answer on this one, unless Matthew wants to definitely come in. Claire.
So NESO, the National Energy Systems Operator, is a very necessary entity in this modern age and in a more strategically planned energy system. And I think the journey over the last few years has showed us why we need a more strategically planned energy system, is that we cannot rely on the volatility of the fossil fuel market to deliver what we need for consumers and also to deliver the energy transition. Again, the strategic approach gives strong signalling to the private investment market, who are absolutely critical delivery partner in all of this. So, yep, we are really, as a sector, pleased to see this. Where we need to be more circumspect, I suppose, is thinking through Scotland's role in any strategic spatial energy plan. There are a number of different energy pathways. There are lots of different ways for us to reach net zero. There are lots of different ways for us to power this country. Scotland has a very unique set of gifts which it can offer into that system, one of which is an abundance of wind power, onshore and offshore wind, as well as having key strengths in certain geographies around solar. We also have hydropower, which is pretty unique to the Scottish landscape as well, which has got a really strong part in that energy system, as well as actually contributing, can help reduce costs by providing large-scale and long-duration storage in there. Like I say, there are very different choices that could be made through these different energy pathways, and there is one of the issues that we need to be really clear about, is that there are some pathways which will include the technologies which we excel at here in Scotland, and there will be some pathways which do not. Ensuring that our voice is heard at that table is absolutely critical. And I think if that was one thing I wanted to be very clear about, is that we need to be clear-sighted on what the governance of NESO looks like in relation to a Scottish context. So where does our voice get heard at that table? How does our voice get heard at that table? Because as I understand it from conversations with ScotGov, that's very much a soft power. And the analysis that will go into these different pathways could be absolutely critical to our future economic growth and our future success. So I think it's a very important issue that needs very careful consideration.
So is it an appropriate level of detail? And we've got national planning framework still waiting for energy strategy in Scotland. We've got council development plans. I mean, I've sensed a kind of concern within the industry about, planning to the nth degree, effectively going down the route that Wales went down with TAN 8 years ago, where, you're kind of designing in exactly where wind farms should be. Is this an appropriate level of strategic guidance? And does that give comfort and confidence to industry, but also does it give an element of kind of knowledge to communities about where energy development is likely to be, the extent of that, without saying it's going to be this wind farm over there?
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. There's a level of detail that you probably wouldn't want it to go into, which is we want this wind farm over that. I think it needs to be viewed alongside a number of other policy instruments that are in play at the moment, one of which is connections reform, which is an absolute step change. And I have to be really clear that in policy terms, we've done a lot of great work in the energy space over a very short period of time. It has been exhausting for anybody involved in the sector. So connections reform is basically helping to create a filter along with this strategic spatial energy plan, which will in fact limit the level of development that will go on potentially in this country and in Scotland in particular. So the connections reform plan and the connections reform activity is designed to ensure that whatever is sitting on top of what is a valuable grid connection is needed and is necessary and is ready to connect, so that we can actually manage the energy transition rather than simply just taking a clutch of projects and then realising that we don't actually have the storage to make this work, or we're now creating constraint costs because we've added so much generation without actually adding storage in tandem in order to manage that. I think on top of that, again, to give people in communities and different locales some confidence, you then have local planning, which is designed again to be a robust mechanism to ensure that the right things get built in the right places. So with these 3 different mechanisms, you actually have a limitation on what will get built out. Again, where we need to think really hard is in Scotland, we, through the Scotland Leasing Programme, have created a number of absolutely exceptional floating offshore wind projects. It's a newer technology. It is therefore a more expensive technology, and so we have to be quite clear about whichever approach is taken to whichever pathway. There are ways in which we need to be very upfront about the cost reduction pathway for something like floating offshore wind, because it is not just about creating that technology, it's about what that technology creates as well, which is supply chain benefits. That is our opportunity to reindustrialise manufacturing and parts of the UK, parts of Scotland and the UK, North East in particular, which has that real strength in terms of supply chain companies with offshore and subsea expertise.
Okay, Gemma, do you want to add anything on the back of that?
I think in terms of your question about how granular will it be, it's very hard to tell at the moment. We're not that far progressed through the process, and to be frank, the information that we're getting from NESO is not of the detail that we feel we need as an industry to really make useful, to give useful commentary back to NESO.
Is solar in it? Solar feature?
Pardon?
Will solar feature?
Yeah, solar is in there. Solar is in there based on the Clean Power Action Plan 2030 that was published at the end of 2024. But we don't know the details of how solar is playing out in the modelling, or indeed how any technology necessarily plays out in the modelling that is gradually being whittled down by NESO. One of our key concerns around visibility, and visibility for everyone really, is that it's only going to be one plan that's consulted on, or one pathway, and we feel that that's really narrowing down the focus too soon. We really need to see some options and be able to really interrogate the options before we consider one preferred approach. And going back to the point about the balance between Scottish Government scrutiny and NESO's authority in this, we do have a concern that there is so much authority and, to be honest, so much pressure being placed on NESO at the moment to do so many things. There's strategic energy planning, which the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan is a part. There's also the connection reform process. Then there's wider network reform. There's just so much stuff that we're all trying to grapple with, and NESO is having to take the bulk of it. But we don't have confidence, frankly, that NESO is able to be as clear and communicative as we need it to be to understand the options that are in front of us.
Right. Matthew, do you have anything you want to add? No? Okay. Can I turn now then to the consenting process, and in particular, so we're talking about over 50 megawatts because the Energy Consents Unit. Aware that the Energy Consents Unit has increased capacity with staff. There was a commitment, I think, to bring the time for making judgments on consents down. Has that had an impact? Are we still looking at significant delays of projects over 50 megawatts, or is there signs of the system picking up, while at the same time, obviously, maintaining the important involvement of communities and stakeholders and contributing to the evidence taking? Do you want to, Claire, do you want to go on that?
So one of the great things about the Energy Consents Unit is that it's a specialised resource, and that is not to take away from the role of local authorities, but we do have to be really realistic that in constrained times, a lot is being asked of them in particular because of the rollout of renewables, which is accelerating in pace. So I think we need to be really clear that the investment, and it is an investment in the ECU, an additional resource and an additional specialist resource is is welcome. We all recognise that it is a specialism and therefore will take time to develop and grow, and that we are also grappling and dealing with probably relatively unusual and different situations in terms of consenting of larger projects and consenting of associated infrastructure as well. So there's a huge element of dependency that sits on this transmission infrastructure, new substations, new overhead lines, which are all a connected part of a jigsaw. That would be my only observation, is that we've had good interaction. I sit as the chair of the SOEC group, in which Cabinet Secretary Gillian Martin is my co-chair, which is focused essentially on the offshore sector, and this is probably what Adam would have talked about had he have been in this session. The level of transmission infrastructure upgrade required to facilitate those offshore projects is unprecedented, and I know that that's a word that's used a lot, but it's also an incredible investment programme of £22 billion worth of investment, and today creating jobs and doing skills investment at an exceptional level. So I think our support of that is really, really important. I think the devil is always in the detail with planning. The devil is always in the detail, and we've got a really strong framework in terms of MPF4. We've got real strength in terms of things like the ECU and being able to do that. What we have also done is, through various different kind of sectoral plans and deals, is try to add some certainty in terms of timelines in that, because that's what industry's always asked for. And those have come forth, you know, in terms of 52-week decision making in there for Section 36. I think, again, it's the execution. The policy is there, but it's the execution of that. So, for example, starting to hear about potential cases where your 1 year could turn into 2 years, depending on things like requests for additional information as opposed to supplementary information. I did say this was detailed. And then subsequently, whether that would trigger a rework of a kind of public inquiry, which could then extend those timelines. The problem is, with every extension of the timeline of grid infrastructure, you then actually push the projects back even further. And so being able to monitor and track how that is all happening as a whole is complex, but it's something that would be really helpful to help understand how planning is enabling the energy transition.
Okay. And that 50 megawatt threshold for Section 36, is that too high? Is it too low?
No, it's a really interesting one, and it's one that Matt will probably have more on, to be fair. But to reach a 50 megawatt target now is an awful lot easier because the technology has changed, which then means that you're pushing an awful lot more down to local authorities. And as I said, we are asking a lot of them in terms of the requirement for more specialism, for more resource in general, and that ability as well to understand wider impacts like environmental impacts and socio-economic benefits of some of these sites. It's obviously out and under consultation at the moment, so we will be, we'll be adding our response into that. I do understand the reason for it. I do understand that things move on and things need to change. I do think we also need to be very clear-sighted about what that change in itself will require of the system that sits below it, i.e. the local authority planning system.
Okay. Matthew, do you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you. I won't profess to be all over the detail in terms of the consultation. I know it came out or closed last week, but I think in general principle of translating some of the responsibility from national to local authority level would strike me as a potentially more democratic way of doing this, at least in the place-based context, and might start to create the sense amongst communities, certainly if they have voted for those local authority representatives and they feel a greater representation at that local to regional level, that they feel they have more agency over these decisions. I think where that then cuts against some the kind of the realities of this is, one is how well resourced the local authorities going to be able to deal with this additional time and resource pressure upon them. Obviously, dealing with this consenting process is going to be a very complex issue. And I think also kind of stepping back to the NESO point, if you are planning for a low carbon electricity system, and you're doing so by connecting supply to storage to demand, there needs to be a strong degree of system architecture to that. Otherwise, if you let it unfold organically and evolve without any degree of system architecture, you might not end up with the system that you need to deliver on your carbon reduction targets, but also to keep the lights on, to ensure that energy is affordable. So we end up in this kind of tricky position where you are wanting to provide communities and local authorities and the representatives that lead those to make decisions about what happens on their patch. But at the same time, what happens on their patch has a knock-on effect to that grid, the stability, resilience and affordability of that. So I think we need to find a balance between the two, and we cannot assume swinging from one side of the pendulum to the other is going to be the fix.
Okay, Gemma?
Just to pick up on Matthew's points, I mean, that's where the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan is intending to help, along with the regional energy strategy plans. And obviously local plan making. But yeah, there is absolutely a huge issue with lack of resources and lack of training. And rather like the TNUOS discussions, there are some things in this industry that keep on giving, and the lack of resourcing in local authorities is one of those. And also statutory consultees, to be honest. There could always be more resource and more expertise.
Okay, so to bring it back to the climate change plan then, I mean, the assumptions that are in the climate change plan about rollout of renewables, about electrification of society over the years to come leading up to 2045, I mean, does that architecture of consenting processes, of responsibilities over transmission charging, and does all of that align with the CCP? Do you think the assumptions in the CCP are solid on the basis of the architecture of planning and consenting that we currently have, or are there actually challenges coming up? Are the assumptions around how much generation capacity we can bring in the next 10, 15 years going to struggle with what we've got right now in terms of markets, planning and the rest of it?
Yeah, I think that you've elated upon one of the key kind of points that I was hoping to make, which is one of the things that I guess needs to be uncovered a little, which is, again, around that stops along the way of how do you get from 57% lower down to kind of 94% lower, is, what's doing the heavy lifting at each and every of these stages, and I don't think that's clear. And enabling that heavy lifting, which is being very kind of hard on ourselves about whether these different policies that are outlined within the plan are actually doing what they need to do. Are they efficient? Are they effective? Are we tracking them? And are we able to do that? And I think the other thing that's possibly missing in here is that list of key dependencies, which is, there's a reliance on new technology, there's a reliance on private sector investment, there's a reliance on the relationship with UK government, there's a reliance on the relationship with local authorities, none of which I'm sort of really seeing quantified, and that's hard to do, but none of which I'm seeing acknowledged, really. In here there are a number of key players and there are a number of key activities and actions and assumptions, as you said, that sit within here that probably could do with being uncovered in a bit more detail.
So, I mean, example of that with onshore wind, I think we're meant to be rolling out 1 gigawatt of new capacity each year to get to the target, which I think is incorporated into the climate change plan. Are we on track for that, or is?
Again, it comes to a number of key assumptions that would allow us. Yes, we've got the number of projects that we need. We definitely do. We've got more projects than we need, actually, and that's again, where connections reform and other things are coming in there. Are they deliverable? Are they deploying? Again, that's something that we need to keep a really close weather eye on. You've got you've got that key link now. So this was the first time in terms of the CFD mechanism at UK government level. We'd seen a real kind of analysis of this is what we need to get through to stay on track for 2030. And I think that there are similar mechanisms within Scotland that are within the devolution settlement and within devolved control that we too should probably be trying to track, as in, are we consenting enough projects to go into CFDs? at the right pace and at the right, at the right level in order to do that. And things like repowering, for example, there's a great opportunity here in Scotland, and it's a nearer term opportunity, which is about repowering, but it is going to need a particular style of management. It's not going to be the same as what we've done before. This is about, fewer, taller turbines, but it does mean complete rework of some sites in order to optimise that. We just know more than we did before. Our technology is better than it was before. But again, is our planning system geared up to enable that? To enable that kind of replacement of sites going offline as well. It's not just about building new sites. It's about ensuring that we maintain the static base as well, because we're adding to it.
Okay, thanks. Matthew?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the purpose, or at least the focus of the climate change plan, is about laying out the kind of broad brush direction of travel, the emissions reductions that are associated with this, some of the costs around this, and then pointed to some of the mechanisms that will be able to deliver against this. I agree with Claire's point entirely. For the kind of for the boffins and the wonks out there wanting to get into some of the detail, the quantification of what this policy will cost, what this policy will then deliver in terms of carbon reductions, and what this will then deliver in broader co-benefits, indirect benefits to Scotland more generally. I'm assuming that's going to come down the line. I guess one of my sort of wider observations and maybe concerns is obviously this is happening just before the next parliamentary election, and the extent to which this climate change plan will then be followed through after that, and any time lost against that is naturally a concern against meeting our legislated carbon reduction targets. So we want to see the detail on how these will be enacted, but obviously I'm assuming that won't happen for a little time. Certainly wanting to wait for the dust to settle against the electoral results. So that does raise a concern about timing generally, and we haven't got time. I haven't got time to spare.
Okay, Gemma?
I just wanted to say something in terms of the ability to meet these targets, but in ways that perhaps are faster than has been traditional. So there really is no clear focus on the role of solar and batteries in this in the climate change plan. There is lots of battery storage out there that's already been installed, and there's a lot in the pipeline. But batteries do have a real role in addressing the curtailment issue that we have. So we're talking to NISO and DESNZ and Scottish Government about the fact that having a lot of batteries in Scotland is not a bad thing. It's a great way of trying to address the constraint issue. They tend to also not take as long through the planning process for various reasons. But there is also the potential to co-locate solar with wind, and this is something that again Scottish Government, UK Government and NISO need to think a lot more about, because in theory they use the same connections, they're generating at different times. If you use battery as well, then the additional power that's not needed at any given point can be stored. It's a great way of using the infrastructure that you've already got more efficiently. However, there are ways in which NISO and DNOs, transmission operators, etc., think about these things. They see it all as additional capacity needing more wires, and that just simply isn't how it needs to work. And then finally, just focusing on the built environment and transport are going to be huge areas of decarbonisation in this next phase as things get harder, now that we've basically decarbonised much of the grid already. But we're still not there, obviously. Everyone's demanding more energy. There could be a much greater focus in this plan on not only the things that are defined as clean heat by government, but expanding that to actual on-site generations so that we can bring the costs of heating down. We can take pressure off the existing grid by, powering lighting and cooking, etc., not just heat. So the role that solar has to play in the built environment is huge, and also in charging EVs. You know, a heat pump won't charge your EV. If you have solar and battery and a heat pump, you're basically your own little power station, and that really isn't acknowledged in this plan. And there is huge potential.
Okay, so something that really speaks to householders about what they can do to cut their bills and cut carbon.
Yeah, and the benefits for them. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. We'll go back to you.
Before we leave this and we're going to move to the next questions with Douglas, I just want to ask a question, Claire, a comment that you made, and it's specifically at you. I think that everyone's probably agreed that if we're to get the public to sign up to this, they need to be invested in it and move forward at pace, I think, as Matthew said, because there isn't time to spare. So we talked briefly about the ECU. In previous days, you used to be able to submit an objection to the ECU by email. Now you do it, which of course was never published because there was never time to publish it, so the public never knew whether their views were taken into account. And now we've gone to a system of an online portal, which I'm never quite sure whether I understand whether that's going to be published or not. But the timescales are particularly short for objecting to consents, which then feeds those people who want to object their objections to it because they haven't had time to look at the massive documents that are submitted in support of some of these projects. I reckon that's fair, Claire. Do you think that's fair to the people that are putting up with the infrastructure? That's a question to you and you alone.
I think we inhabit a different world now. And my previous career was in communications, and things are moving a lot faster than they ever did in terms of community involvement, in terms of people being able to avail themselves of information and facts. So I think there probably is a case for having expedited some of these systems, because we don't use letters anymore, we use email. I think the other thing that we have to be quite clear about is getting our head around the ability to respond to genuine and real concerns and make sure that that is what we focus our efforts on. Again, we sit in a world where I speak to my members and we hear a lot about AI generation of objections, which may well reflect the views of communities. But I would hope that before we got to that point, and I don't just hope this, I know this and I see this, that my members would have been out with boots on the ground, actually standing in town halls and village halls and everywhere else, explaining themselves to the people who are sitting with these projects on their doorsteps. I think what we have to be clear about is that this is a very rapidly changing sector. There are different characters and players within it, right? So you've got a very different response, I guess, from somebody like Ocean Winds, who resource up and deliberately, put themselves out there into the communities because they're investing in assets in there. And some other parts of the system, so for example, we have asset managers, for example, who probably are quite prevalent in things like battery storage, because that is part of just a changing shape of land use as well. And there are different things that you can use these things for, and they will engage in a different way. Our key message to our members is to engage early, engage often, and to ensure that we've got a really clear set of answers to when will this reduce our bills? What does this mean for our energy system? Why are we having to do this? And how will this actually impact in the long term?
And I think your members probably are quite good at it in most cases. As a surveyor with planning as one of my core things, I do find it difficult to read all through the documents, but I also know how much aggravation it causes constituents, and I also know how the high-handed approach of some of the transmission companies that build these lines really annoy constituents on the ground. And I will hold up my hands and say I have been one of those that have been on the sharp end of somebody's do this or you will get a compulsory purchase order served on you, which I don't think is a negotiation. On that note, I'm going to pause it for 5 minutes to allow people to stretch their legs. We'll reconvene here at 11:05. I would just say that we're on question 7, 20 to go, and we've got 40 minutes. So you can try and work that out if you want to, but a brief pause till 11:05. Thank you. Welcome back to this meeting of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee. We'll go on to the next set of questions, which comes from Douglas Lumsden. Douglas.
Yeah. Veena, we've touched on it already. Just to get the views on the AR7 results that came out last week. Claire, can I start with you first?
As I said, I am really pleased with the result, but I am worried that that result isn't replicable, and I've said that because of the transmission charging. I think what we did get out of it were two exceptional projects. So in terms of Pentland, which is a floating offshore wind project, and Berwick Bank, both of which have really pretty unique characteristics in terms of what they bring actually into the sort of Scottish energy market, if you will. And by that I mean not just investment, but I mean kind of players, and I mean kind of economic activity. Berwick Bank is a challenging project. There is no two ways about that. Challenging because of its size and challenging because of its location. So it will make us aware very quickly about how effective some of our strategic approaches are now going to be to things like managing environmental impacts as a result of actually having larger scale projects out there, larger scale commercial projects out there. It's obviously been split into two. One of the reasons why it was successful is because of where it connects into in terms of transmission charging. So that was a key tailwind, if you will, which I think is, as I said, not replicable. The other thing is around having that strength in terms of SSE Renewables as a company who have already delivered significant numbers of offshore wind turbines here in Scotland, and so understand a lot about ground conditions, they understand a lot about supply chain management, and they understand a lot just generally about the technology and how it operates and maintains. So we were very lucky that I think that contributed to a real keenness in terms of price in that AR7 auction. On Pentland, on floating, it's great to have something that's kind of starting to step us up in the floating market. I think that is a real critical feature of something that we need to make the most of here in Scotland, is that if within the ScotWind portfolio we actually have an exceptional strength in terms of the diversity of projects, which give us a real credible scale-up pathway. And again, that scale-up pathway is essential to us here in Scotland, because what we actually want to see is supply chain work, and we want to see our workforce deployed on energy projects. And actually, if we make the most of what we've actually set in place already, which is that ScotWind leasing round, going into actual deployment, we really stand to be able to grow that strength in terms of supply chain and manufacture as well, that we are so desperate to see secured as a result of the energy transition.
So floating's obviously got huge potential, but when we look at the cost, the CFD cost of floating offshore wind, it's almost 3 times higher than the wholesale price of electricity. So how do we get to a point where we can get floating offshore wind down to a point that it's not more expensive than other forms of electricity, so we can actually rely on it more? And also, is it all about the supply chain? Is it all about I don't know, just trying to industrialise the process? How do we get to a point that it's much cheaper? Because surely at the price point it is just now, we can't really deploy it too much, because it's just going to see everyone's electricity bills increase.
Yeah. I think it's an absolutely fair point, and a good understanding of exactly how the CFD works. One of the things that it has been really successful at is being able to create certainty and investability for projects, and it's done that really successfully in fixed bottom. I think arguably, in terms of fixed bottom, we probably didn't gather along the way the supply chain benefits that we wanted. What we did get was a rapidly reducing price, which was exceptional. What we're hoping to do with floating is to do things slightly differently, which is to create, let's say, that staged scale pathway to floating projects in order to make sure that they can deliver those supply chain benefits. And to be clear, if we want additional things to come with projects that come through the CFD, they probably will come with additional costs alongside them. But that's what the CFD is there to manage. It manages it in lots of different ways, which is that by creating that certainty and investability, you reduce the cost of capital, which is one of the key components of cost in terms of our current energy sector, because of that reliance on private sector investment. But you're absolutely spot on when you say that actually being able to get more clarity on which technology choices we're using to make them as cheap as possible through dealing with the TNUoS issue, because that's a particular issue for floating, because they sit further off offshore. Also, a lot of new plans coming together around things like offshore generation hubs and offshore transmission hubs, which again may well add costs in terms of innovation, but overall will create a better overall system and for us to enable in the future. But stripping out costs all along the way through creating a credible project pipeline of scaling up floating projects as we go is one of the key ways to do this.
So how much work is your members taking? How much is taking place by your members just now to actually move forward and to try and innovate and reduce those costs as much as possible? And does it require more CFDs in the short term to decrease that cost in the long term?
So again, there's multiple factors at play here. So you've got, I mentioned the clean industry bonus. So that is a sort of pot of money that is sitting alongside the CFD, which is contributed to largely by developers, but also, who are successful through CFD bids, but also through government. Part of that will fund manufacturing, onshore sort of UK manufacturing, which again will come with a level of cost reduction within that, because we will be able to exploit economies of scale, economies of scope with that as well. So that's a really, really important part of that. The other programme that I would point to is things like the FlowX programme, which is designed specifically to look at, it's got a few emissions, but one of them is to look at cost reduction, but the other one is to look at innovation as well, in terms of the technology to try and fast track those pathways, because we do recognise the need, if we are going to rely on floating projects for their cost reduction pathway to be as rapid as possible, but to not lose the key component parts that we want, which is to embed supply chain and manufacturing here in the UK as we go.
GB Energy playing a part in reducing the cost of floating offshore wind in the long term?
Yeah, I think everybody across the sector has got a role in all of this. GB Energy has got multiple different functions, and it sits alongside other entities like National Wealth Fund and Scottish National Investment Bank, who've actually made clear investments in, for example, the Pentland project, which was great to see, because when you've got entities like that involved as shareholder, not just stakeholder, it means that they do have a hand in actually how those projects are deployed and how you actually derive more of the benefits as we go along the project pathway.
Matthew, can I come to you now? How long are we going to need CFDs for? When are we going to get into a position that projects just can stand up on their own 2 feet? If I think back at oil and gas, they don't have CFDs. They just have they have to produce that is going to make money at the end of the day. They're not guaranteed a price for each barrel of oil. So when's renewables going to be in the same situation?
Yeah, thank you. So I think Claire's point about certainty of price is the key here, and that depending on the strike price and then the wholesale price of the market, you will see these technologies either paying back or being paid in to meet that strike price. So I don't think it's fair to frame the CFD in the round as a subsidy for all technologies. Sometimes they might be topping up, but sometimes they'll be drawing back. And that's really the way to think of it. And we know, anecdotally, but also, speaking, I'm sure you've had witnesses, in fact, probably today, and Claire said as much, certainty is everything, and that builds confidence and builds investment. What we need to be clear about is that the CFD prices for different technologies reflect their maturity. So your point there about, to Claire a moment ago, about floating wind having a higher CFD strike price, absolutely and correct. The question is why? Well, this is a less mature technology. We need, if we believe there is a place for it in the energy system of the future, and that's a whole separate discussion, which I'm willing to kind of get into if needs be and time permits. We need to invest in that to bring those costs down for all the reasons that Claire mentioned. In time, the next AR allocation round, the one after that, we should see these strike prices falling. But this technology, floating wind, has not been in the marketplace for as long as ground-piled offshore wind. It shouldn't be standing shoulder to shoulder and competing with it on pure cost terms if we wanted to grow and blood that market. However, I think we need to ask ourselves, well, and this goes with many other immature technologies, not and growing industries, not just energy, I might add, but where is the UK's domestic content associated with this? Is this going to feed back into sort of Scotland PLC and tax returns? Is this something that we have a stake in? Will it generate jobs in terms of the manufacturing, fabrication and installation? And I think these are all legitimate questions when you're going back to your original question of why are we investing at such a heavy premium against this technology? Well, these are the answers why.
When it comes to floating offshore wind, what should we be aiming to manufacture in this country? Have we got to really think, look, maybe like the motors, let's not touch it, we can get that in, and maybe we should be focusing on some of the stuff we do already for oil and gas, like the moorings and everything else. Should we try and go after everything, or should we be more focused?
I think this is a very good question, and one that we've been asking ourselves for a long time. I think we are where we are. There are manufacturers who can provide these technologies and component parts at a cost which can be delivered against these strike prices. And if we were to, from a standing start, having to establish entirely new aspects of that supply chain, that would take time and would likely induce a significant cost. I think, however, what I want to come back to is the thrust of your point, which is we should be manufacturing wherever possible. We should be looking to understand exactly where we can add value to the supply chain, where we can grab domestic content. Because I'd like to come back to a broader point, which is the geopolitical challenges and shocks of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the oil and gas prices and our reliance on imports. I am concerned more generally about the geopolitical issues of us being so reliant on non-domestic supply chains. However, we are where we are, and we want to provide our consumers with value for money, and we want to buy the cheapest, best quality components to deliver these projects as quickly as possible. Again, we're in an imperfect situation, but where domestic content can be invested in and grown, I would strongly commend that.
So thinking of all of this, I'll stay with you, Matthew. How do we get everyone's electricity bills down in the next 5, 10 years? What do we need to do?
If we're looking at domestic, and I think that's where your average voter is thinking. My sort of dual fuel energy bill. The electrical component of that is going to be. Actually, what's probably going to happen if we're going to electrify is our in the round, our electricity bills are going to go up, right? But our gas bills are going to go down. Our fuel bills in our vehicles are going to go down. And the hope is, because an electrified world, the way that we would drive our cars or heat our homes, is actually going to be a more efficient means of doing that, that this will bring costs down. However, a lot of that has, is bound up in many of the market and wholesale cost issues that we've already talked through. So, but how do we do this? Really, it's about getting affordable electrification technologies in people's homes. And that really is at the heart of it, around economies of scale. I think the Warmer Homes plan that the UK government have brought forward is a real change in tack from the previous government, which is, and I'm not suggesting this is 100% correct, I might add, but they are shifting away from fabric first, which is about insulation, loft, wall, double glazing, more towards electrification, so getting heat pumps and batteries into people's homes. Now, the benefit of that, and I might add solar, rooftop solar as well. I think they're looking to get that into 3 times as many homes that are currently got it across the UK by 2030. This will really supercharge those supply chains and hopefully start to bring costs down of those electrification technologies. You can say the same for EVs, and that should then follow forward into lower bills. So yeah, that's the theory, and I think we are starting to see that unfold, but we're in the very early stages of it.
But we're not really seeing electricity bills come down. Okay, we maybe see some, heat pumps maybe be getting slightly lower. I'm not sure, but we're not seeing electricity bills get lower, are we?
Well, it depends at what sort of level you're asking that question. So if we're asking for the household who has fully electrified their home, probably yes, they are seeing a reduction. I want to say this is energy bills here. Obviously, their electricity bills, if they've electrified, have gone up. But their overall energy bills have year on year, month on month, are likely to be falling when you include EV, in-house battery, solar PV, heat pump. But obviously they're paying back on the capital cost of this. And that capital cost, as Claire said at the very opening point, can be significant and can take many, many years to pay back. The question is, who picked up that bill in the first place? And how is it being paid back? And again, I think what Scottish Government and UK Government are, with the advent of the warm homes, both committed to do around low interest or even zero interest loans, such as Home Energy Scotland, of which I myself have made use of. These are a fantastic way of doing this by removing that initial cost barrier and taking a slice of those savings to pay back the capital costs over a very long period of time.
Gemma, I'll come to you now. How do we get electricity prices down?
I mean, it's much the same as what Matthew said. I mean, the challenge with the renewables sector has always been that the capital costs are very high compared to the ongoing costs of the fuel. And in the case of, changes to a domestic household, the ongoing running costs will be very low, but the upfront capital costs are quite high, or higher than people are used to. And it's trying to find ways of making that upfront investment less significant through the likes of loans, or in some cases for the poorest groups have grants so that there is no cost. That's really going to have to be how we pay for it. There is going to have to be a lump, an increase in overall costs before they come down, just because of all of the things we're trying to change at the moment.
If we think about solar, how do we get into a situation where people don't need grants, don't need incentives? They just think that's the right thing to do. I will save money. Because just now it seems that people will only do it if they're getting a grant. And I guess that means everyone else paying more to pay for that grant.
Well, so we saw at the height of the energy crisis in 2022, after the invasion of Ukraine, we did see a huge spike in the cost of energy, the cost of electricity, and we saw, therefore, lots of people installing solar for the first time in ways at a sort of rate that they hadn't done since the height of the feed-in tariff, sort of 10 years previously. So if the energy costs are high enough, then people will do it themselves without a support or a lower finance option. But obviously we don't want to be in that situation where energy bills are crazy high again.
Yep. I promised I wouldn't do this at the beginning, but of course I've broken my promise. I am going to have to start reining people back on time. I think you've got another question on onshore wind. I might push you to that question. Because we are rapidly running out of time, Douglas.
No, I think everything's covered in the questions of.
Do you want to do onshore wind at all?
No, we covered it in the R7 question.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, Sarah. I hope I'm not going to have to do the same to you, but over to you now.
Okay, thanks. I've got a bit of a cold, so hopefully my voice won't disappear. I want to ask a question about what the benefits have been of renewables. We've had a significant increase over the last 10 to 20 years. What are the lessons learned in terms of benefits? And then I'm going to come back to ask you about where have we missed out. So first off, benefits. Claire, you represent the sector. Do you want to fire off with that answer?
I will, and I will be as quick as I can. So the reason why bills aren't coming down is that gas sets the price 85% and gas is really expensive. That's why bills are not coming down in the short term. To do that in the very immediate term, you either use less as a household or you generate more. That's the choice that I have taken, and as we've all accepted, there's a capital investment that goes along with that, but it means that my house, which is my main asset, is now worth more than it was before, because I can sell it to somebody with a clear head and a clear face and say this house is cheaper to run than it would have been when I took it on. In terms of 5 to 10 years, what you need to do is flood the system with more and more cheaper fuels. That is the solution here, which is that you push out generation as quickly as possible, and you add as much transmission infrastructure as possible, because again, the lack of transmission infrastructure is one of the things that's adding costs within that complex system. So that's the way to go with that. What have we missed out upon? I think it is that manufacturing piece, and there is an enormous opportunity. I think, Douglas, you asked the question directly, what should we be doing in this country? We've now got a cables factory here. It is not that long ago that here in Scotland we were manufacturing grid switchgear. We could be doing that again. HVDC, so the high voltage direct current stuff, which is utterly necessary for the long distance transmission that we are talking about from things like floating offshore wind farms, is an incredible sector. It's an incredible manufacturing prowess as well, and it's one that I would love to see here in Scotland. There's no reason why we shouldn't be doing that here.
Thanks. And also turbine production. You've mentioned Berwick Bank earlier. You know, we could build the kit at Leith. How do you get the certainty and actually make sure it happens, not just approve a project, but make sure that the renewables developers actually follow on and do that manufacturing and the supply chains, because they've got the confidence when they get the project approved?
So I think when I look at something like a £22 billion grid programme, which is currently on SSCN's books, I think a lot of questions need to be asked about the local content in there. The levers, as we know, in any sector, this isn't unique to the energy sector, to nail and to ensure local content are actually quite light. They're very difficult. And not as strong as we would probably want them to be. However, if you look around and look in particular at the EU, for example, they are bringing forward new policies that are enabling onshore manufacturing. So again, there are. If you look down to the northeast of England, for example, they've again seen really strong success in terms of building factories. We now have a number of different entities, like GB Energy, like National Wealth Fund, like Scottish National Investment Bank, who are ready and willing to invest. They've invested a lot in terms of ports so far, which are an essential part, particularly of the offshore wind story, but also the onshore wind story. Make no mistake, these bits are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, so transporting them by boat is definitely becoming more and more prevalent in that. But yeah, it is about trying to blend together all these different sources of funding, including private sector funding, and that is utterly critical, because we don't want to be in the position where actually the public sector is funding all of this. You do want private sector funding in there because you need them to be a key stakeholder. And exactly that you want investment in something that they see as an asset and that they see has got a future. And I think that is absolutely anything is possible, in all honesty, if you wanted to make it happen. There are certain specialisms. So, for example, that HVDC stuff, they were talking about it taking 7 years to get somebody up to speed in that. If we don't do it now, we still won't have it in 7 years' time. So actually thinking very hard about what is our supply chain development plan that sits alongside this energy transition plan is one of the absolute critical actions I would say ScotGov need to think about.
Thanks. Matthew, do you want to come in on this one? Opportunities, what we've delivered, what more could we have done?
Yes, thank you. It's a very good question. I'll maybe just briefly touch on jobs, and then I want to just come back to community benefit funds and kind of through that lens of benefit. So the information I think outlined in the climate change plan points to jobs from both oil and gas and renewables. It was for me quite enlightening to learn that they roughly the same. You've got about 47,000, according to the information presented there, FTE jobs. I think that was the Fraser of Alander who'd presented that information. And I think the value there of oil and gas jobs was, I think, 53,000. So that's a mix of indirect and direct employment. So there we have it. Part of this puzzle is that we have, in terms of benefits, there are thousands and thousands of households where food's being put on the table through the renewable industry. Obviously, there are questions about what that displaced and all the rest, and we won't have time to talk about that, but it is paying these paychecks. Turning to community benefit funds, this is, as I say, the kind of primary mechanism, or at least one of the most high-profile mechanisms of generating benefit to local communities. At the moment, and we've taken these numbers from the Local Energy Scotland's Community Benefit Register, which I'd just like to say is a fantastic resource, and hats off to Local Energy Scotland for putting this together. This is a voluntary register. We think there's about 1 in 2 projects that have CBFs are included in this, but we're just still running the numbers on that. Adjusting for inflation, there's just over £40 million of community benefit fund money going into Scottish communities in 2024. Now, the value per megawatt installed, interestingly, is roughly where Scottish Government have asked developers to put this out, which is £5,000 per megawatt. This actually grew quite dramatically after they introduced the good practice principles back in 2014 and updated that in 2019. As I mentioned before, sadly, this baseline hasn't kept in line with inflation, so there's actually a shortfall of about £2,000. If you'd adjusted that baseline inflation value, baseline value of 5,000 in 2014 to current day, you'd be much closer to 7,000. So there are communities that are missing out with that value being taken forward. They're missing out on potential benefit. I think what's also important to say is that we've also kind of run the numbers trying to correlate between where this money is falling against indicators of social deprivation across Scotland. And the kind of headline of that is there's a weak to very weak correlation between where that community benefit fund money is falling by constituency and how deprived socioeconomically that constituency is. Put it in simpler terms, it is just as likely to fall in a constituency that really needs it versus one that doesn't, in terms of those levels of deprivation. So there's a real onus here on ensuring that the way that we design, structure and govern those CBFs is done in a way that prioritises progressive investments and targets tackling that deprivation. And that's why we've worked with Foundation Scotland at the University of Strathclyde to pull together our guiding principles and actions for enhancing community benefits from community benefit funds. Foundation Scotland manage roughly £1 in every £3 of community benefit fund money falling in Scotland. And we've come up with a set of principles and underpinning actions to ensure that these funds are managed by the people, for the people, and build community wealth and tackle socioeconomic deprivation where it's most keenly felt. I can make a point about, maybe just last point, make a point about ownership. What is interesting through these community benefit funds is it isn't just money, it can also be in-kind benefits, and that may take the form of shared ownership. However, we're seeing very, very few of these projects coming through. There's a huge pipeline of potential projects, roughly about 1 gig of projects, 1 gigawatt. But in terms of what's on that community benefit register, we identified 58 megawatts of shared ownership across 8 projects. That's about 0.6% of the total capacity on that register. So very few projects, big questions about why. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to bring in a question I was going to ask much later because it fits in.
Just before you do, Sarah, the Deputy Convener wants to come in on this subject. So can I bring him in and then come back to you for your next question? Sorry, because he wants to ask it the supplementary earlier. Just briefly.
Yeah, thanks. It's just following up on the issue of supply chain opportunities and the critical nature of them to deliver a just transition. However, it strikes me something that we haven't really touched on that much, and time is against us, so we'll not be able to do it, but it's the elephant in the room, and that's grid. And the delivery of grid at the scale and nature that needs to be in order to unlock projects, to unlock supply chain opportunities. Claire, can I ask you, from the industry's perspective, if we don't see the delivery of the grid capacity that's necessary, whether it be for SSEN or SPEN in the south, to the level that's required, what is the risk to the renewables industry and to the potential of unlocking that supply chain opportunity?
No, they are all absolutely, they need to be aligned, and that is the absolute point here, is that we are at the point now where We have heavy levels of constraint here in Scotland because of our lack of investment in grid, and the only way to create a coherent system now is to add more grid infrastructure, to add more storage, and then in the end of that you're able to bring forward your projects. A project would find it exceptionally hard, I would say, to be investable if it had no clear sight at all of grid. And it's one of the reasons why, through connections reform, they have sought to introduce more certainty into that, is to, one, help to chew away at that cost of capital, but to also enhance the ability for projects to reach financial investment decision because of that promise that grid will be delivered when we say it will be.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Sarah, I'll come back to you.
Come straight back in on that answer that you've just given us. Don't we miss out on joined-up thinking regionally? And is there more the Scottish Government could do on this? Because I think you've all mentioned heating in terms of heat pumps, not mentioned heat networks, which strategically could be a good way to use electricity where it's produced, provide heat. And then we've also got transport, and EVs have been mentioned, but not railways, not big infrastructure where you could actually take power close to where it's made. Do you want to come back on that one? And then Gemma briefly, because you're nodding your head.
Briefly, right, okay, I'll snap it into two parts really quickly. Yep, so one of the areas of the country where we see the most development, but also some of the best planning that has come across us, and by planning I don't mean planning system, I just mean strategic planning, has been in Highland Council area. They have recognised that this industry has a lot to offer them in terms of jobs, in terms of skills, and in terms of wider socio-economic benefit, and have actually assimilated that into their local development plans, which are actually pretty vast. That's a really helpful way to think about things, because it does kind of allow us to then move in and have conversations about housing, for example, and how creating massive projects in that area is going to put pressure on other services like housing, and being able to have a clear sight of that has been really, really helpful. On heat networks, you're absolutely right. One of the areas that we've missed a lot or have not done a lot of work on has been that thinking about how demand is going to change and shift over time. Thankfully, the creation of NISO and these regional energy spatial plans will help us to do a bit of that. I do think, again, there is a bit of a gap about what the drivers are in there. Heat networks are an excellent way of creating bang for buck, and we are really pushing ahead here in Scotland in terms of heat networks. You'll notice that the Heat and Buildings Bill has altered its view of things like heat pumps and changes at individual household level, but has maintained support for things like heat networks, because they do form part of joined up infrastructure plans at local authority level. Also helps to connect the community to it. One of the most successful ones I've seen was in the Port of Esbjerg, where the heat network is housed around about the port. And we have lots of opportunities like that in Scotland through rivers or seas to use those as power sources for heat networks, but also to create these incredible civil engineering projects, which again will deliver jobs as they go.
Thank you. And did you want to come in on that point, Gemma?
Yes. So I did see that there is a lot of emphasis on heat networks, and obviously they do have a significant role to play. I would just be nervous at putting most eggs in that basket when there are other ways of decarbonising the built environment that may be faster and cheaper. So just in terms of these targets and being able to achieve them in a timely fashion, I think there maybe need to reconsider the balance. But just in terms of your point about transport and decarbonising transport, obviously there are private wire agreements that can be established between individual generators and energy users, such as like the rail network. In London, there is an initiative to decarbonise the underground, and actually a lot of community energy groups are selling their power or parts of their power to the underground, and that kind of initiative could take place all over the country. And yeah, lots of good work that co-ops are doing already.
That's helpful, and it kind of leads me into my next question, which I was going to ask Matthew about, which was the community benefits angle and the community ownership angle. because you said there was a missed opportunity there and we weren't moving forward in terms of how we get the right community benefits that actually are going to benefit people in the way that's needed. And I was just going to ask, isn't there a mix of community benefits opportunities but also community ownership opportunities? We heard at a recent cross-party group the benefits of Point and Sandwick, for example, huge community benefits compared with other projects. So is there a way for the Scottish Government to encourage more community or shared ownership of renewables projects so that that would enable the focus not just on community benefits but also community ownership, which could be council, it could be individual communities, or it could be cooperative models? And how would you get that actually delivered in practice?
Yeah, okay. So I think first thing to say is that just on the benefits piece, we need to consider initially what the project, from first principles, what impact is the project having locally, regionally, and in which quarters is seen as a sort of, as a boon or as something that is undesirable. So I'll maybe give the example, wind farm near me, the Whiteley wind farm, just to the south of Glasgow. Of a weekend, of an afternoon, you will see plenty of people up there walking the dogs, going for a run, mountain biking, all the rest. It's become a space that is being used by the local community and beyond. Now, this has got nothing to do with its community benefit fund, which it has separate arrangements around that. But we have to also look at the impact that it's having on natural capital, ecosystem services, and the impact that is having down the line. So first principles, what impact is this having? How is this impacting the community? Then the secondary point is, right, well, on balance, how do we address this? How do we rebalance this so that this is seen as beneficial to that local community? There are a wide range of opportunities, and just to emphasise, in-kind benefits are just as powerful, in fact, sometimes more powerful than money, because when the money comes to the community, they are then having to manage that, administrate that, and distribute that. On the point of ownership, absolutely. We've spent a number of years, UK Energy Research Centre's Community Energy Finance Project, which I was a part of. We broke down all the different types of ownership models, all the different types of finance that can sort of make up a community energy organisation. And there are a myriad forms here. They all have their own respective strengths and weaknesses. And I think there needs to be a clearer sense for communities about what options are available. And I think the final point, given time, is that ownership can be alongside other partners. They don't just have to be private, they can also be public, local authorities. And I think that public ownership piece is a really interesting model as well. I think it's the Quantaness wind farm, which is an example of where they are actually distributing the funds. They've taken public finance through the National Wealth Fund, there's local authority ownership, and they are distributing the funds to community councils. In many ways, this is a third model versus the kind of purely private. Number two would be the private with a community benefit fund, and you can actually have public. So there's a real blend. People should be open to the options and blend these accordingly, given the options on the table in front of them. And sorry, the final thing to say is there's a risk and reward piece here as well. So for any community wanting to step in and own, they have to accept the risks as well as the rewards too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm just going to briefly bring in Mark if you want to ask a question on community benefit, but I'm afraid it's one question with one answer.
Sure. I'll probably target this actually more towards Matthew and Gemma, and it's just around, whether different technologies like solar should be required to pay out perhaps a different level depending on the economics. And then I'm also interested in, with wind farm repowering, and perhaps at life extension, whether some of those historic community benefit deals that were set at maybe £1,000 a megawatt need to be revisited, perhaps with a £5,000 a megawatt or whatever is current standard on that. Matthew, quick points on that, and then I probably will go to Claire actually because I mentioned onshore wind. Matthew.
Yeah, thank you. I'll keep it brief.
That was the one answer that I was looking for, which is two. I'm sorry. Matthew first. Yeah, I know, Mark, but there are other people on the committee who are waiting for answers.
But it's the same point, so you could have answered it by now. Right, Matthew.
different levels are being already paid by different technologies. Solar PV isn't on the community benefits register as far as I understand, last time I checked, but you will see higher values for some technologies versus others. Onshore wind, for instance, has a higher value versus hydro. Hydro has a higher value versus offshore wind. The repowering, I assume, but I would defer to colleagues, once it's repowered, there may be a renegotiation of the community benefit agreement, and that may yield a different value paid per megawatt installed. Right. I think that answers most of your questions.
Thank you. Gemma?
Yes, there are different levels, and there will need to be a different level for solar than for wind. But we can go into the details.
Okay. Claire?
Just very quickly, absolutely, but what we need to recognise is that project costs have gone up at the same time across the board. So we need to be key about what the viability of projects looks like.
Right, okay, thank you.
Right, Bob, you've got the next question. You've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Yet again, the committee ends up about 40% of the question we have to ask squeezed into about 20 minutes. It's like speed dating for politicians at this stage, as I've said previously, Convener. I am going to briefly go back on the community benefit stuff, because I was reading through my notes and it's more about the developing technologies, really impressive, but uncertainty around the offshore floating wind stuff, and that's a tiny amount of the community benefit at the moment, but it's also not obvious who the communities are that would be impacted by that, and there'll be a lot of communities in Scotland who are low income, high energy costs, but because they can't see a wind farm in front of their nose, they don't get the benefits of if you like, community benefits. I'm just wondering if the large-scale offshore floating wind is an opportunity for a wider range of Scotland, particularly communities blighted by high energy and low incomes, to benefit from Scotland's natural windfall. So any comments on that, I think, would be really helpful. Claire Mack, perhaps?
I'll go super quick in that benefits come in many forms. So some of them are, as we said, as Matt said, they are less tangible, but some are in terms of jobs, some are in terms of being able to spur that manufacturing business that we were talking about. The other way that they do contribute, and again Matt touched on this before, is where the rental money goes from offshore wind, because you're right, it is quite difficult to identify the community. Once operational, offshore wind farms in Scotland will pay about £171 million per year in rent to Crown Estate Scotland, which means over the lifetime of the projects, the Crown Estate Scotland will receive about £6.6 billion in rent, which is the equivalent of about £4,700 per megawatt per year. So there is, in that form, some form of community benefit going in to do with the rents. In terms of what they will also do, notwithstanding anything else, because there are discussions going on about shared ownership and actually very strong, innovative shared ownership models in that floating market, certainly through some of the Nadara projects that we are aware of, is of course their power to reduce bills. I talked earlier about flooding the market with cheaper energy. Floating offshore wind is exactly the vehicle to do that, which will flood that market, which means that gas will set the price less often, which is how you bring down bills.
Really helpful. Can I skip yourself, Gemma, and go to Matt? I apologise. Matt, do you want to brief comments in relation to this?
Yeah, this is a tricky one. So the first point is about how do you define the community, and how do you then boundary that community? Obviously, offshore raises a number of questions about how that fits in there. I think there's a kind of a broader point about what is the Community Benefit Fund actually for, and I think that's got lost in all of this. These sort of started to rear their heads 15 years ago. It's happened in many other industries, not just in the UK or Scotland. We've got mining, landfills, oil pipelines. So what are they actually for? Are they to compensate people for being co-located next to these things? Question mark. The Scottish Government framed this, and it's there in black and white. This is not a form of compensation. Yet, I can't really see how else these have been, how else these have emerged within a context of pushback against certain types of renewable technologies. If it's not that, then what is it for? Is it in lieu of ownership? Is it about redistributing the benefits that come from these to make them seem more acceptable? If so, at what level? Is this local, regional, national? So for me, if it's about blight, then offshore, and there's a reason, maybe, I'm not suggesting this is my view, but why is offshore commanding a lower CBF value per megawatt installed than onshore or hydro? So I think we need to look into this and ask ourselves, first principles, what are these for? And then the second question is, how should they be structured going forward?
I think those are all really helpful points. Thank you for that. My next question that I have, and I'll roll my questions together. I'll come to each witness once, and I'll have had my time, convener. Oil and gas has come up a few times. We heard some support from the renewable sector saying the energy profits levy may be counterproductive more generally because of impacts on the economy. We've heard the links with skills, the skills sector, and we've heard talk about how renewables can wash its face financially the same way that oil and gas can. Although I would note that over the years oil and gas has significant and deep tax cuts and billions of pounds forgone in taxation to promote development of oil and gas. So I think we need to be balanced when we talk about subsidies that different sectors have had, but not that-withstanding. Whilst the Scottish Government doesn't have powers over the licensing and production in the North Sea, that sits reserved with the UK Government, it would generally be interesting to hear the views on this from witnesses, so that would be helpful to put that on the record. But also, in answering that, whether the levels of activity within the oil and gas sector has an indirect impact on renewable energy more generally, and get some of that on the record, I think would be really helpful. Gemma, maybe start with yourself, given I didn't take you in last time, if that's okay.
I don't really have anything to add on oil and gas. Admittedly, I wasn't expecting to answer questions in relation to it. Yeah, I'll pass to others.
And my apologies for taking in the previous question, Claire Mack.
I think on that issue, my point is around dovetailing. And it is very much about dovetailing what we need for each sector and ensuring that at the moment in time that we need it, it's there for us. So to give an example, to be more detailed, we have, I went to Shetland in the middle of last year, and obviously you have key facilities in there in terms of Sull and Voe. And we also have an ultra-deep water port potential in Shetland. That ultra-deep water port would be really, really helpful to any of the potential conversations that are going on around tiebacks and around, the current oil fields that sit in that region. But also very helpful to potential floating offshore wind farms in the future. So I can see that there is a need for us to be really clear about which assets are critical to both my sector and the oil and gas sector, and work through how we manage that. I don't think we should take this as bluntly as thinking should we or should we not licence. It's about managing the decline of one sector and managing the growth of another.
Professor Hannon, sorry. No. If Professor Hannon doesn't want to come in on that, Claire Mack, can I just push you just slightly further on the comments you've made? Are you suggesting that should any future licences be granted by the UK Government, there should be a clear business case made, and as part of that they should be explicit about what the impact will or won't be on the renewable sector, and there should be clear and perhaps direct benefit on the renewable sector, and show how it would dovetail? If you could elaborate that on a little bit, that'd be quite helpful, I think.
Yeah, so I think, to be clear, as Scottish Renewables, I don't represent the oil and gas sector, so genuinely we have not made a pronouncement on the licensing point, but I agree with the comments that you make. I think it would be exceptionally helpful as part of Scotland and the UK's energy transition story to understand what the strategic assets and strategic benefits are to being able to manage that transition in a more strategic way.
Okay, thank you.
Let you finish, Bob. Sarah, I think you've got a brief question you want to ask.
Thanks very much, Convener. Yeah, it's just really a supplementary to Claire. You mentioned a few minutes ago the benefits of looking at innovative shares that could be taken. When you look at the ScotWind projects, actually the vast majority are owned by countries out with Scotland. And when I say countries, I mean some of the governments out with Scotland are making really good benefits from investing in ScotWind projects. So in terms of the real benefits, how do we get some of those benefits more for us in Scotland? Is there an opportunity? You've mentioned the National Wealth Fund, you've mentioned SNIB. Are there opportunities in terms of Scottish Government taking a share in projects that could then give us an economic benefit as revenues come in over the years?
Yeah, I'm not clear what the funding mechanism could be for that, but if I think about what's already in train, so through things like the Scottish National Investment Bank, let's say they've become effectively shareholders within Pentland, so I think there's that. I think the other area where I would suggest that there's more scope to explore, and it is, I think Matt referenced this as well, is that there are funding models that we need to explore, and my colleagues and friends up in the Highland Council are thinking about this too at this very moment as part of their sort of strategic development plan, which is how do you apportion risk for some of these big projects. The reason why you've got massive entities like governments in the ScotWind programme is, and sometimes, you know, some of the oil majors are in there too, is their ability to be able to weather the financial risk that goes along with this. That is absolutely central to that question of how do you encourage further shared ownership, which is, as yet, I've seen more conversations around shared ownership fail than go forward, and I think Matt again spoke to that in terms of the numbers, and largely because as these projects get bigger and become more risky. And we've started to see even established players kind of fall out the market. Even last week, ENBW, government in the heart of that, have walked away from a number of offshore wind projects because they simply cannot weather the costs that go along with that, because they are changing, ever changing over time if you're talking about things like transmission costs. But you've got also things like rental levels being set quite high by some colleagues down south, which was a real issue in that particular case. So being able to create these financial models which would enable the risk to be shared in the right way to allow other entities to come into the projects is central to this. Yeah.
Projects, but presumably there are opportunities in smaller projects, for example, in towns and cities and urban areas where you could do community-owned solar rooftop. You know, there are other opportunities out there. It's how you lift it up the agenda and make it more investable.
Yeah, I think that is a really important part of the whole piece here is actually city decarbonisation and creating opportunities for cities to be part of this as well. And I think that is a really important next step that we need to think about. I've taken the decision as a householder because I want to have control of my transport costs, and I want to have control of my energy costs and my heating costs at home. I think everybody should have that opportunity, and I genuinely do believe, again, talking to Matt's point, is that there are lots of ways that we could tweak the system that we are currently in to maybe make it more equitable in terms of how you distribute community benefits, in terms of how you look for different sites and availability of access to cheaper fuel sources where you can, whether that be ones that sit off-grid, because quite often in cities you actually do have that capability to think about that, but perhaps Gemma would have more.
Yeah, I just wanted to come in on one of the funding approaches that has been announced fairly recently is GB Energy potentially taking a role in community energy. So we don't know the exact form that this is going to take, and I don't know the extent to which Scottish Government will be working with GB Energy, but there is the potential to take sort of public-owned shares of these projects, or indeed own them outright.
So I should probably just put on the record I'm a member of the Edinburgh Solar Co-op, and at that point I appreciate your indulgence.
My twitchiness that I've got 1 minute and 30 seconds to get in 2 questions. So the first one is a very simple one. The committee's taken a lot of interest in hydrogen and the development of hydrogen in Scotland. We haven't really had a chance to talk about it this morning, but considering that things are changing with the climate and we have less water available, is hydrogen going to become an important part of of energy production for renewables through wind, offshore and onshore? Does it help? Is it a yes or no answer, I guess, from Claire and Gemma, and solar, obviously?
Is it a yes or no answer? Yes, we do need to understand where the demand is coming from for hydrogen, though, and then therefore build the finance models that will enable it.
Okay, but you think there's a role for hydrogen?
I do. Yeah.
Gemma.
Agreed.
Okay, perfect. So that allows me to get the last question in, which maybe is the simplest question of the whole session. We don't have an energy strategy in Scotland. We had a draft laid in, I think, 2023, and we had an update on that saying everything was changing so fast in October last year. Does the climate change plan provide adequate clarity for future investment on the fact that we don't have an energy strategy? Claire?
I wouldn't have said that the climate change plan could replace the energy strategy. I think it's really important that we get our heads around that, particularly as part of this conversation about a strategic spatial energy plan. I think it's not just about having policies and strategies, it's also actually having the analytical capability within the civil service, within government, to understand which parts of the strategic spatial energy plan we really need to see ourselves in the heart of, and to understand Scotland's role in the future energy mix. Really important.
Gemma?
No, it's not sufficient. We absolutely need an energy strategy. And linking back to what was said previously, we need a supply chain strategy to go alongside it. And the skills strategy, I think, ran out this last year. So we need another one of those.
Matthew?
No, it isn't, but I wasn't expecting it to be sufficient. And I think whatever energy strategy comes out needs to sit alongside other strategies, transport, buildings, agriculture, and these then need to be mapped against the Just Transition plan as well, against a robust set of indicators that can gauge how much progress we're making against these different sectors in terms of net zero and beyond.
Okay, and the cynic in me may say that it might be very difficult to produce an energy strategy just before an election, so why not hold it off to afterwards? I'm sure that's incorrect. But thank you very much for the evidence that you've given this morning. I'm sorry that I've had to rush you, but I can't control the clock. I wish I could. But thank you for all the time and effort you put into this morning, and the committee will now move into private. Thank you.